Okay, we're ready to begin the afternoon session. Matthew, are you up?
Ready?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Sure.
So we've got a jam-packed afternoon here. We're going to start off with a little bit of a summary of the public comments on the bat listings, and then we're going to move into CWD, and then elk, bear, and bobcat updates, followed up with grouse, and then finish up with pheasant and quail. And so we've got a packed afternoon. My goal here was to try to fit as short a presentation in as possible, with the understanding that if any of this needs followed up, and we weren't able to hit every species today, but in the same way we did for Commissioners Fredericks and Furbearer, we did some good presentations offline. And so if anybody has interest in that and wants to do maybe a turkey presentation with Mary Jo or non-game species with Kathy or something like that, we're happy to do that as well. There's just a lot of information to cover, but feel free anytime to contact me, and we'll be happy to set that up. In addition to that, I want to take this time and introduce our two new staffers who I'm very excited about. We've been very fortunate to get these guys here, and just can't say enough good things about them. And actually, this is my 1-year anniversary, and so I'd really like to say what a great blessing it's been to work with all these folks in this bureau. It really is, in this agency. But today, I'd like to introduce Ken Dern and Sean Murphy. And so Ken came from DCNR. And so he's here as our game bird section supervisor. Ken and I got to spend some time a couple nights ago. He's got a lot of cool things he does after hours, makes wine and beer, and runs bird dogs too. So he's going to fit really great in around here. And Sean Murphy, the state ornithologist, is also here. Sean's got an awesome background and just really excited to be here, and we're excited to have him. So I just want to make sure that I address both of those guys. And so with that, I will turn this over to Greg, who's going to talk about the summary of comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you, Commissioner President Layton, Commissioners, Director Burhans, and staff. Thank you for the time to come up here today, and we're going to summarize the comments that we have received since the last meeting where we preliminarily approved the status update of the bat species. So as we know, just a little background, this is a problem caused by a disease. So it was in 2008 when white nose syndrome came and decimated our cave hibernating populations. But as you can see, we do have a few remnants of each of these decimated species that are still hanging around. And it is those populations in particular that we're really trying to focus our protections on, and where the status update offering protection of those species will come in and help these species out. So just as a brief overview, it was around July that we began calling some of the industry folks that have been involved with the agency since 2013, when we had a workshop on the bats. And then again in September, as you know, the board gave preliminary approval to advance the status update of these species. It was in about mid-October when we opened up the public period for comments, and that was open for about 3 months, and it just closed last Friday. So we had our last comment Friday night at 7 o'clock, and all of those are included in here. So in total, we had 33 total public comments received. I was kind of expecting a little bit more than that, but we had 27 from the general public. We had 2 nonprofit organizations represented in that group, and we had 4 from industry representatives. So the big take-home summary was that none of these comments opposed the bat listing status updates. And I would certainly like to thank all of those people who came in person here to present some comment, as well as private citizens. As you already heard, they all supported the listing. There was a couple notable comments that I kind of pulled out. One is that the PGC is obligated by law to protect these species, and the listing is long overdue. Then we had comments from 4 industries. Those were the First Energy Corporation, the Marcellus Shale Coalition, the Pennsylvania Forest Products Association, and then the Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association. As far as the comments went, First Energy expressed support for the listing, while as the other 3 did not oppose the listing, they submitted a list of concerns and questions. And we're going to try and address some of those concerns and questions here coming up. So First Energy, which represents about 2 million customers across most of the Commonwealth, their first major take-home comment was that they support us continuing to defer to the Fish and Wildlife Service when it comes to the federally listed long-eared bat. That is something that we, of course, had proposed to do. First Energy supports the targeted protection of maternity and hibernation sites. And I highlighted those words because I think they're very appropriate terms that they kind of pulled out and used. But what we're proposing to list to protect is the sites where the bats are the most vulnerable. So we're looking at the maternity sites where the females are gathering together and raising their young. And we want to protect those young because if we don't, they won't be able to recruit into the adult population. And we'll lose that chance of having that population stabilize and recover. And also the hibernation sites, where they're physically in hibernation, they're very susceptible to many, many things. Any little stressor can cause them to lose energy or cause them to actually perish. And this is also a point where the females are holding young, getting ready to reproduce in the spring. And so disturbance of that can actually limit how their offspring and their success at having that offspring. And overall, as we said, First Energy supports the listing of the 3 species. Pennsylvania Forest Products Association, they submitted a list of questions. A number of those were very similar questions, so I tried to kind of pool them together a little bit where needed. But one of their first questions here relates to take permits. And again, we see this confusion with the federal process and the federally listing. And, you know, very expectedly, industry is very gun shy when it comes to the Indiana bat and the protections that they've had to deal with. And so we see this reiterated down. And so this question is, will take permits be issued if impacts are unavoidable? And since what we're saying here is that is a federal term used with federally listed species. So the quick answer is no, we will have nothing to do with take permits. The protections will only be provided through the PNDI system that we use with all of our listed species. Will the currently permitted projects need to be reevaluated? To the best of my knowledge, the answer of that is strictly no. Once the species would be approved by you, it is at that point that we would submit data over. There would be a lag period before that data is entered. It would also have to be published in the bulletin, I believe, to be finalized. And from that point forward, new projects being submitted would have that data available in the system for them. So currently permitted projects would not need to be reevaluated. What impacts do forest management activities have on the spread of white nose syndrome? White nose syndrome is actually a disease where the bats are hibernating and they're underground, not when they are above ground and in trees. And white nose syndrome also is already statewide. So we're really not too concerned about forest management activities spreading white nose further. This one has come up before and came up a couple times, but since the long-eared bats are currently listed as federally threatened, will the PGC continue to defer to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? And the answer, of course, is yes. So nothing will change when it comes to the northern long-eared bat. Seasonal restrictions have been in place for a number of years. What have these restrictions accomplished for the recovery of the bats? And this is a really good question and a really difficult question to answer. And it's not something that we can answer conclusively from a scientific point of view. The best I can really provide on that is that Indiana bats were afforded these seasonal restrictions, not only in Pennsylvania, but across the range. And while they were, and prior to white nose syndrome, we saw Indiana bat populations increasing. We saw that here in Pennsylvania. We saw their population spreading out to new sites, and things were actually looking pretty good. And then white nose came and everything went out with the trash when that came. So it's hard to say conclusively that seasonal restrictions were the reason for that growth and that expansion, but it sure does look like it had some positive impacts. And then the last question the Forest Products Association came up with was, what remedies are available to actually combat white nose syndrome, and are there any plans to implement the remedies? As you know from prior presentations, there's a number of different things that we've been trying, even here in Pennsylvania, some different strategies and different tactics. We're trying some real molecular stuff like gene silencing, trying to make the fungi basically incapable of producing disease. We're trying things like breaking the cycle of infection. So we talked about spraying down that whole site this last summer, where we're trying to basically prevent the bats from picking up the disease in the first place, picking up those spores. And if we can do that, we can break that cycle of infection. And we've also been trying to manipulate the temperatures of sites, making it colder so that the fungus doesn't grow as well and the bats can save energy that way and do better that way. So we've been trying a lot of these things, but the take-home point is that much of that is theoretical. None of that is really truly a tool on the ground for managers anywhere to use. And so that's why we need to combine these efforts as they work along with protecting these remnant populations that are out there. Switching to the next group was the Marcellus Shale Coalition, and one of their first comments was that they encouraged the commission to evaluate options, some different options, which included assisting with white nose syndrome research in lieu of seasonal tree clearing restrictions, developing such a research fund or other efforts as mutually agreed upon. And the Game Commission here, we're certainly open to discussing some mutually agreed upon alternatives to protect the bats, but really what it comes down to is we want to see those remnant bats protected so that we can stabilize the populations and move towards recovery. But so we'd certainly be open to that and open to further dialogue. Would it be helpful if the commission it would be helpful if the commission stated a time frame by which the additional data for these species would be added to PNDI? So should the process move forward and be approved, I don't have an exact time frame it would take, but we would be able to get the data submitted probably within a couple of weeks, and then it would probably take, I'd say, 3 to 5 months, maybe 6 months before that data and the polygons that would be associated with it before they could all be entered properly and for it to become activated. So there would be a significant little lag effect there. And then it's our understanding that the commission would enter data from 2012 to present. We've actually, after looking at the data, decided that 2013 to present would be more appropriate. And the reason being that as white nose syndrome spread across Pennsylvania, it spread to the west from the northeast. And in the western part of the state, back in 2008 to 2010, 2012 even, there was a lot of Marcellus shale activity, a lot of other oil and gas activity out there. And so there was a lot of surveys being done out there. And I think there was still a number of bats migrating in from Ohio and West Virginia and places that didn't have white nose syndrome yet. And so we still had a good number of actual captures in the very western part of the state and the southwestern part specifically in 2012. And so we kind of felt that 2013 forward would be more appropriate to represent the actual survivors that are out there that we're looking to afford these protections to. The PGC notes in the PA Bulletin that proposed action will not result in additional costs or paperwork. That is certainly something that we do acknowledge. There will be additional costs. We're trying to do the best we can at this point to really target that protection to where it's needed the most and try and minimize the delays of time and the delays of costs, trying to just focus on what is needed the most, which is really trying to save those young and stabilize these populations. The PGC did not provide information on what the exact mitigation measures would be if a project encountered occupied active habitat. The time and costs involved with mitigation are a primary concern to the Independent Oil and Gas Association and its members. We did not provide any specific information on that because we have not yet developed those. So should the species be approved, it is at that point that we can move forward developing those exact mitigation measures, and we would certainly do so with the comments that we have received here today in person as well as in writing. There was a question of why are different buffers proposed than those used by the Fish and Wildlife Service for northern long-eared bat, and how are those numbers derived? So we're talking about two different types of species that are basically polar opposites. The northern long-eared bat is a species that's highly flexible. It changes roosts almost daily. It'll roost outside of the area it actually forages in, and they're just very loosely aggregated. They don't all come to the same place. Whereas the little brown bat and some of these other species are highly gregarious. They want to all come to the same spot and raise young together. They will use the same roost spot year after year after year. So they have that very high site fidelity to that foraging habitat, to that roosting structure, whatever that may be. And those young are actually in that roost and using that until they leave to go to the hibernation spot in the late fall. And so our numbers that we use were actually what we used and what we still use today in the PGMLT. The 300-meter buffer is the core habitat, the smallest habitat that was decided upon years ago that was needed for that colony to survive and to maintain itself in that spot. And so that's what we use actively on our game lands, and that is where that number, that 300-meter buffer came in from. And so that's a little bit different than what the Fish and Wildlife Service used for long-ears, but again, you're talking about a species with that high fidelity to a site versus a species that can move all over the place and is just really flexible. The Marcellus Shale Coalition is interested in seeing an action plan that articulates the methods most critical to species protection and a determination if the listing will help or hinder their deployment. So basically right now, if we were to list this with the state, we're not talking the very severe restrictions that the federal government would have. That's something obviously we're trying to prevent. State listing is very flexible when it comes to deploying anything that's out there. So if there are actual methods that can help these bat species, we would not be hindered in any way in deploying them, just because they are state listed. This was a comment from the Independent Oil and Gas that the timing of the comment period, they assert that not allowing sufficient time for review of comments raises questions of compliance with Section 202 of the Commonwealth Documents Law. Before taking action upon any administrative regulation or change therein, the agency shall review and consider any written comments submitted. So I will just say on this topic that the comment period was open for 3 months. It closed as of Friday. We had the last comment was Friday at 7 p.m. And we have, I hopefully in this presentation, addressed all of the major concerns and comments in those written comments. So in conclusion, there were actually no written formally submitted public comments received that have opposed the listing. As the state agency responsible for managing Pennsylvania's wildlife and their habitat, it would be irresponsible of us to ignore the impacts that can be avoided and which compound losses on top of that caused by the disease, white nose syndrome. Without effective protection to the mothers and their young, bats may continue to decline and reach levels warranting federal levels of protection. And this is something that is currently under review by the feds. So they are actively looking at these species, looking to see if they are still declining or stabilizing. So any effort we can put towards showing that they are protected and stabilized may hold off on federal listing of these species. And we are proposing protections that are targeted to the most recent verified active colonies only, in the most important and discrete locations, and only at the time of year when they are in use. So we are not proposing to protect males that are randomly on the landscape. We're just targeting that towards those female and their young, and during the time of year when they are there using that habitat. And with that, I would like to thank everyone who supplied some comments to us. Oh, and I did forget, we had a late-breaking, hot off the press, which I did not include in this, from DCNR, who also supports the listing, and so that will be passed around to you. And with that, I'll take any questions the board may have.
So the proposals that we have coming forward, are they overlapping with things that you're doing already? Are we just expanding on those?
As far as the buffers go? Yes. So right now we're looking at about 30 hibernation sites and about 120 maternity colonies. And this is, of course, fluid because data is always coming in. But that is what we had the last time we looked at it. And there's a number of locations that are as you can imagine in the mining world, there's a lot of holes that are very clear. So there will be overlap. Things that are already.
Okay.
Which I'm fully supportive of, but
You just turned yourself off.
there I'm on. You say only when the bats are there, the protection. So let's use the Sebula tunnel. Let's say that was on private property where the bats are roosting. So if it's on my property, the bats leave, I go in and seal it, blow it up and seal the tunnel up. That's not your intent by saying temporary, right?
Well, let me give maybe a better example as opposed to
trying to understand.
blowing up a.
Well, I mean, we both know that. Wait,
let's say
cave.
the bats there are flying to a tree that's on your property and you own a couple hundred acres, and you wanted to do some forest management activities or put in a development or a strip mall or whatever. There would be a seasonal restriction. If those bats were in that area, that buffer would be a seasonal restriction just in that 300-meter buffer. So however much of that eclipsed your project area, we would be requesting a 300-meter or a seasonal restriction and asking those trees not be cut down while the bats are there using them. And then when those bats go underground for the winter, you may then remove those trees and finish the project. So you'd be able to work on your project area outside of that buffer until the seasonal restriction ended, and then you could finish that and then move forward.
Okay, but let's go to I understand that.
Okay.
The bat cave's on my property. And for whatever reason a landowner has, in the summer, bulldozes that shut.
Yes, it'd be the same thing. So let's say you wanted to start a quarry and start quarrying out the limestone, and the cave was there. If there was not a federally listed species there, I believe that project would be able to move forward. Now, it is our goal to work with a developer to try and avoid that impact, and when possible, minimize that impact, of course.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So Greg, you mentioned PNDI here, but I guess there's the newer versions called Conservation Explorer, I believe, that you can use.
Correct.
So right now, if you were to go in there in Conservation Explorer, do we know those 120 sites or whatever, are those polygons in there today, or are they not being added? So they're not.
No, I have not received the approval that these species are to be listed or have the status upgraded to that point. So that sits in my personal agency database only.
Okay, but it exists in GIS somewhere. Now, you would have it.
Correct, and so I would have to query that out and submit that if this was to move forward. And that was the delay we talked about. That once I submitted that, then they would have to enter that and create all the polygons. And we haven't even decided exactly what all those polygons would be. And the behind-the-scenes stuff is called the matrix. What would trigger a hit? And none of that has been developed at this point in time. So we didn't want to move forward and step ahead.
So you've addressed the bats here, but that same, I don't know if it was in the same publication, that red knot, is it Was there any comments on that listing as well, or not?
I did not get involved with any of the bird listings on that, so I don't know. Dan's in the audience. If we had any.
I think the biological survey yesterday presented a comment. To the best of my knowledge, that's the only official comment that we received.
Was it combined with this one, Dan? Like all of the species that are going to be listed?
It was presented as a
Okay.
But there was a separate email address for bats
Oh,
versus
what?
the birds, and I only had access to the bat one, so I couldn't answer that.
I guess my final question is I understand that, seasonally we don't allow trees to be removed. The problem with that is that we still see people that will go out and destroy habitat in anticipation of a future project.
Mhm.
Because if they have all the shag bark hickories, they're going to go get rid of those in the wintertime.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, it seems like if the goal is to protect potential habitats, which the shag bark hickories would be, we've actually encouraged people to get rid of them ahead of project. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm familiar with a very large project that took place in West Virginia, and we were asked to go out and do what they call a potential roost tree survey, so that all of the potential roost trees could be destroyed prior to the project.
Right. Yeah, I don't really have much of an answer for you. That is the way the system has been set up for a long time. And this system started with the federal process with the Indiana bats and identifying which trees are suitable for roosting. And yes, I mean, we're aware that that does happen. It is always our goal, though, especially with the state listing, where we can, if we had a hit with a project, we work with the developer. We're not coming in like the feds do and saying, you have to do this and this and this and get a take permit and apply for HCP and get that approved, which takes years upon years. We just try and work with the developer to avoid those impacts as best as we can. Therefore, they're not needing to go out and manipulate the habitat and destroy it just because of that. And again, we're not asking them to go out and survey the land. So say you're going to have a project in your mind, you want to go out and you're going to submit that and do a PNDI search on that. We're not going to ask you, just because you're within the range of little brown bats, that you have to pay a contractor and do that survey and you have to wait for that time of year to happen. We're only going with the known data we have. So what we have, and which honestly is getting less and less and less. So the last few years, we haven't captured a female little brown bat via contractors in like 3 years. So.
Thank you.
Does the state or this agency not have a mechanism like the feds do with an HCP to assist industry? I mean, I know you said it was a long, arduous process, but that was the mechanism that they put in place federally, right?
Right.
To help, you get an incidental take permit.
Right.
When you do that. Do we have anything?
No.
Do you, in your opinion, would it be beneficial?
If it was a process similar to the HCP, no. That takes a lot of time and a lot of money on both ends.
Right.
And it really just comes down to you getting to the same point in the end run of the project's going to move forward and they may destroy the habitat or end up taking the species one way or the other. So
You left out one little thing. The thing that's most important to industry is time.
right.
And yes, it costs a lot of money, and that takes a lot of time on both ends to develop an HCP.
Yes,
But
it
what's
does.
attractive, to industry and is they have an incidental take permit in their pocket.
But that incidental take permit costs them millions of dollars and 5 to 8 years of time to get there, whereas they could deal with us in a matter of a couple of days to a week. And
Promise?
I cannot promise that, but it's on the grand scale of things, it's a much shorter period of time and it's a much easier process. And we're doing, and we have to look at this too. Right now, we have no protections on these bat species. So a developer may be very environmentally conscious and may want to protect them, to some degree. They want their project to go forward, but, you know, if that, where I lost my train of thought. Darn it.
You know, my only point, Greg, was, you know, months in the process today, as things are moving today, which in my opinion are very slow in the industry. We haven't seen anything yet. And you know, months is not an option. and at times priceless. And so I haven't heard any objection from anybody, industry or private, about, you know, listing and protecting the species. Everybody wants to do that. It's just a matter of how do we mitigate situations when we get a hit in a timely manner. Do we need to staff up? And I know that's a question you can't answer, but the point I'm trying to make is that everybody's on board. The data doesn't lie. We all know they need protected. But what can we do to accommodate industry in a timely manner so that we don't get legislative backlash? Do you have an opinion?
Well, I mean, the process that is set up, I mean, first of all, industry has been dealing with bats, with listed species for a long time. They know the routine. And so as their project comes online, the earlier they can submit that, obviously the faster that would go through. But when it comes to state listing, like for an example, we have a state listed bat, being a small-footed bat. And we have a mitigation tool, which is building a small roost structure out of rock. So when they are taking habitat, they create habitat on the side, and it has been very successful. And as long as they're willing to do that, they zip right through, and within a couple days, they get their letter, and they agree to build the structure per our specifications. And we've seen those structures built and work within a year for those bat species.
That's what I was trying to get out of you. In my opinion, what you're proposing here for these species is, I think, going to make things a little better for industry and help the species.
Sure. And
That's the way I
the
see
point I kind of forgot was, if the developer does want to do something good for the species and we don't have the system set up, they'll never even know that they were there. They'll never have the chance to avoid or to minimize that impact. Right. And so now we at least have that field where we can converse with them and talk to them about that.
Any others? Okay.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you
Brad.
very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. This should be a review for a lot of the commissioners, maybe new for some of those in the audience. So, as way of introduction, I'm Jared Oyster, the Chronic Wasting Disease Coordinator. If you don't recognize me, it's because I'm fairly new here and you probably haven't seen me before. So, some of the introductory stuff I'll go through pretty quick because you're probably familiar with this as well. CWD is caused by a prion. All the best science that we have supports the prion, which is just a misfolded protein. CWD is always fatal 100% of the time. No vaccine or cure is known, and with that there's no approved live test currently, which means the animal has to be dead to actually take a approved sample. CWD can be transmitted directly from deer to deer through nose-to-nose contact or bodily fluids like saliva, urine, feces, or decaying carcasses. Or also, if CWD becomes established in the environment, it can be transmitted that way through the vegetation and the soil, for example. CWD was first found in Pennsylvania in 2012, first in a captive facility in Adams County, and shortly thereafter was found in Bedford and Blair County in 2013. And these created the disease management areas 1 and 2. And with those, we have special regulations that come with disease management area, or what we call a DMA. For example, travel restrictions out of the DMA with high-risk parts. We have head collection bins, certain processors within, those kind of things. What's also important to note, it's the laser doesn't really reach that far, but you can see in the top left the map of, this is just DMA2. The polygons in the middle is 2013. You can see it expands out from there. If I could point, it'd be a little easier. But obviously the largest polygon is 2017, and it'll expand next year. So each year the DMA has actually continued to expand. And in the lower map, that'll work. Okay. So yeah, this is 2013 here, and just for time, the whole thing is 2017 there. In this lower map, this is DMA2 here, DMA3, and currently DMA4, which is just in a captive facility. And some of our surveillance efforts that have been going on since the early 2000s, actually, even 10 years before CWD showed up, we were testing a lot of deer and elk for CWD. And to date, we've tested well over 70,000 deer since 2002. And the purpose we do these is to detect new cases of CWD within our state, as well as to monitor CWD and the prevalence within the disease management areas that are already set up. There are a couple different methods we use to collect samples, and not just hunter harvest. So we do roadkill deer contracts for deer and elk, hunter harvested animals, escaped captive deer and elk, as well as those that are showing clinical signs we dispatch and test for CWD. So this is a scary figure showing the number of positives that have showed up in all of Pennsylvania since 2012. As you can see, obviously the disease continues to double or even triple every year. And obviously this is a call for action for us, that we need to take more aggressive actions to cause stop the spread of the disease. A very similar figure, and I'll continue to go on this. This is the trajectory of Wisconsin, who has not taken action, aggressive action on the disease for the last 10 years at least. As we can see now, almost 30% of their deer have CWD. And again, to reemphasize, this is 100% fatal, so which means 30% of the deer are going to die within a year or two. Similar trajectory for West Virginia, over 30% prevalence. And this is us in Pennsylvania, the orange line. As you can imagine, this will if we don't take aggressive action, this will continue, and we'll soon have a prevalence like West Virginia or Wisconsin in 10 to 15 years from now. So this brings us to our management actions, targeted removals. So what is target removals? Essentially, it's just lethally removing deer in a small defined area surrounding a new case, a new detected positive. So here is just an example. Say that this is actually one of our positives here. What we will do is we'll draw a 2-mile radius surrounding that positive, and that will be considered our target removal area. And to note, this is target removals is the only known effective method of slowing or stopping CWD that we know of currently. Also, a big question that will obviously be asked is, how many deer are we going to take? And the answer to that depends on our post-hunt population estimates, and those are thrown into an equation. And what we try to find out with that equation and that number is, how can we be 90% confident that we can detect CWD if it's at a 1% prevalence? So let's say, for an example, we do our post-hunt surveys within here and we find 200 deer. We put that in the equation. The number of deer that we need to be removed so that we can have confidence of knowing the CWD prevalence is 135 deer. So generally, 90% of the time, Some of the reasons why we do this are some of our objectives, obviously, is to prevent the establishment of CWD within the area that it's already been detected, to slow the spread or lower the prevalence of CWD. And also a big reason we do is to increase the surveillance, so we have a better idea what the prevalence actually is. If we don't do this, it's almost like we are managing the deer blindly if we don't have a better idea what the prevalence is. Obviously, this gathered information will help us guide our future management actions on CWD. A little bit more of how we do this and some of the logistics. Again, I'll emphasize that this is only for the small areas, the new cases that pop up. This is not in the core CWD area. This is what we consider flyers, which is at least 10 miles away from a known previous case of CWD. So what we will do is we'll contact the landowners in a letter and invite them to a meeting where we will discuss our management objectives and ask for their assistance in helping to combat the disease with targeted removals. And USDA will contact after that all the additional landowners, and they will conduct all the targeted removals during nighttime shooting. The Pennsylvania Game Commission will extract all of the samples and will submit those samples to the lab, so all deer will be tested for CWD. Those that are tested and are not detected for CWD will be donated to the cooperating landowners or to the local food shelters. After all the operations are over and we've reached our target objective of deer samples, we will conduct post-removal population surveys to determine the number of deer that are remaining in that target removal area. And with all of the target removal locations that we do operations, we will provide a news release internally as well as for the public to give more details of how the operation went in terms of number of deer, number of positives found, those kind of details. So just in summary, that CWD poses a significant threat to the future of our deer and elk herds. And with no action, as I showed you some of the figures, we know where we would end up, and we'll continue to, CWD is going to continue to spread in prevalence as well as in new areas every single year. So we will conduct target removals in the areas where CWD is detected in new locations. So again, target removals is the only currently known method of combating CWD once it's already detected. And with that, I'll take any questions that there might be.
First question is when, and how long is the response time?
What do you mean by the response time?
Response time, you get a positive, we're already 2 months behind. When we get, because it takes a period of time to get the information back from the lab.
Yeah, I think that will depend on a case-by-case basis, and ideally we'd like to have, most of our samples come in winter. So we submit a lot of the samples in December, so some of those results don't come back until April if it's an IHC test. To answer your first question, all the target removals will happen in the winter. Once the deer hunting seasons are over and hunters have had their chance to collect the samples that they want. So it'll be January through the end of April is the time period that we would use for target removals. And I think the response time depends on when it's detected, really. So if it's detected at a roadkill deer in the summer, which some of these are, then we wouldn't actually start target removals until the hunting season is over. We would establish a DMA, allow hunters to collect more samples, and then we would do the additionals to supplement beyond that to get the samples that we need.
So if we get a roadkill deer in April, we're going to wait 10 months, 9 months before we do anything. How much has spread? Do we have a way to figure out what the conditions are for that to spread? I mean, that animal, if there's a buck that's infected, we know through the entire season that he's moving around. Now targeting the family group, it doesn't matter any longer because he's well beyond the family group. Now we've spread it outside that area. I think we have to, I get the politics of it. I get what we need to do, but I'd like to see a more rapid response team, and I think as commissioners, we've said that since 2012, that we would like to see a rapid response team set up and ready to go when a positive is detected. Doesn't have to wait until after hunting season to do that. My other thought was, and one of the complaints that we get from hunters is that you're taking their deer. Why do we not make those deer that are targeted available to the local population, which may in fact take some of that argument away and give, deer that aren't infected with CWD could be donated to the local hunters and local people in the area, because that's a deer that we're removing from them.
Right. And so on that point, I think we want to move towards, so right now we have the DMAP permits, which allows for additional harvest within those disease areas. But I think for these targeted removals, we want to move towards more of a face-to-face interaction with those landowners and say, and we don't have this permit type system set up yet, but I think it would be helpful for us, and we would get a lot more support from the public if we were allowed landowners to have access, so many permits before we access for targeted removals. So I think that's a better sell for them, and it's much better for us as well.
Any other questions? My biggest concern, I think, is public support and public notification, and the timing that we're doing those things in. And I know that I've been to some of the open houses. I know what public support is difficult at best, especially with the hunting population. However, again, as an agent, we have a responsibility to do what we need to do. So I think I'm more concerned about public notification and when we get the word out. I know that there's, we're getting ready to do some public shooting, some targeted shooting. And unfortunately, instead of the word being put out by the Game Commission, rumors start on Facebook. Mm-hmm. So now instead of us putting the facts out to the public, now we're not just battling putting the facts out, but we're trying to quash all the rumors, and they're talking about us using nets to herd deer to do, and that's just unacceptable in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So I mean, what's our goal moving forward as far as getting the word out, so we're not trying to clean up afterwards?
Yeah, I do think this is going to be slightly different on these target removals than it is for the larger pilot response project, because this is small and targeted. But I do agree that we think we need to have a public news release before we do these to inform the public and have the right details out there before the rumors start spreading. We want to do it in a fashion, I think, where we don't identify any specific landowners that are cooperating, because that can put them in danger and kind of in their privacy as well. But we do want to do a news release so that, like you said, the rumors don't start spreading like we're trapping deer and we're killing them. That's obviously not what we're doing. And we will have, like I said, landowner meetings to discuss with them, because if we do knock door to door, it's harder to get questions answered to everybody. If we sit down and landowners can see a presentation and all their questions can be answered at the same time, I think is a little better method. And then also notifying the public in general before we do these.
Do the tests really take 2 months to come back?
The tests?
Yes. And I think that's what you said. It takes like 2 months before you find out.
Oh, well, it depends what kind of test you do. So the tests that we do for when we go to processors and collect just for our purposes just for surveillance, that's tested with what's called an IHC test, and that does take a long time. But if we do an ELISA test, which is much quicker, and those can be batched in like up to 96 samples at a time, those can be back in a couple of days. So for these, when you do target removals, we shoot deer, we send the test in. Hopefully they come back within the week. We can keep these deer in refrigerated trailers until the tests come back. The ones that are positive, we would dispose of properly, and the ones that are not detected, we can either give back to landowners that are cooperating or send to a processor. So those results should come back really quickly. But the ones that we get from hunters that we just randomly sample at processors, those can take several months to come back.
That kind of goes back to your question, right? So, I mean, the response time is much less when you do a target removal. So, you get positives on a target removal, you're going back in there to take the family group out, or what's the plan after the positives come back?
To be honest, we don't really have a plan on what we would do with that if we have additional positives. Initially, target removal is just to find out what is there, and then we would make management actions after that.
Anybody else? Any questions?
Just, when you went out and you did your landowner conversation, you had your meeting with the landowners, why didn't we sign people up then? We told them that we were gonna be in the area. Why didn't we do some preliminary sign-ups at that point, still waiting till we had to go door to door to sign everybody up? And then, of course, the word is out prior to our releasing the information that we're doing such. I mean, I think we're trying to, again, we're chasing our tail, trying to catch up and get rid of the rumors when we should have been proactive in the front of it and started out earlier.
That would be the goal, and we actually haven't done any of these landowner meetings yet. We're still in the process of compiling a list of the addresses that we'll send out, and that hopefully will be sent out by the end of the week for these areas that we're going to do this, and the meetings will be, maybe 2 weeks in advance from that. And that will be the purpose, is to sign up landowners, and if we don't have enough access at that point, we will continue to knock on doors, because if they don't show up to the meeting, if only 3 people show up to the meeting, we may not get the access we need, obviously. But
So what we're talking about is when we get that, that hit that's not in an existing DMA, and we want a rapid response and an action to that. How are we trying to determine whether that deer came from a local deer farm?
well, we can take DNA from it. That's really the only way, obviously, and
Are we going to do that? I think we should.
I think that is the plan, is to take DNA. Am I, Chris? Yeah.
Because, these are pop-ups, and it's like, where are they coming from?
Yep.
Unless it fell off the back of a truck, a live truck, where did it come from?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And one of the issues with that as well is that we don't have a lot of DNA from the captive facilities. It's going to be difficult because we don't have their DNA. We have a pretty good sample of DNA from wild cervids, but not from the captive ones. So it's a little bit of a hang-up.
And they're not putting tags in the ears or anything for us to know?
I don't think there's a requirement to, but a lot of them do.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, thank you. So now I'm told that Dr. Rosenberry's coming up. We're not leaving. We're not taking an official break. We just have to hit the pause.
Yeah, there needs to be a pause for a moment, apparently. Lori will tell me when I can go. That'll make people dizzy. Okay.
Well, how are we moving forward with a plan that we don't know what we're going to do to figure out the plan?
I've been given the green light to go.
Welcome, Dr. Rosenberry.
Thank you. It'll be short, but I don't know if I can get it to 5. Good afternoon. While Jared's presentation covered our response plan or plan of actions on individual flyers away from established areas, what I'll be talking about will be specific to an area where we have CWD established. A year and a half ago, we were directed to evaluate management techniques to answer this question: can we control CWD? Fieldwork began last year with the collection of baseline data, and we're now into the next phase where we will evaluate these different CWD management actions. And just to mention our collaborators, we are working with USGS, Fish and Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit at Penn State, as well as USDA Wildlife Services. This study includes areas where we will be applying different management actions. Throughout the entire CWD DMAP Unit 2874, which is the red outline there on the left, and it's hard to see here, but southern Blair County, northern Bedford County are a part of that DMAP unit. We have increased hunting opportunities throughout that entire area. In part of the area, though, we will be looking at increased opportunities plus targeted removals. And without action, CWD will continue to spread and affect more deer. Wisconsin detected CWD in 3 hunter-harvested deer in 2 counties back in 2002. Today, 55 of their 72 counties are affected by CWD in some way, and about 25% of the deer tested in their core area are testing positive for CWD. West Virginia detected it in 2005 in a roadkill, and today in their core area, nearly 35% of the deer tested have CWD. As Jared mentioned, we detected our first 3 free-ranging deer in 2002. And since that time, within our study area, which this is slightly different than the graph that Jared showed, but this is within the study area that I showed on the previous slide, this is the trend that we're seeing in terms of the percent of our samples that are being infected with CWD. In addition, here's a map of our study area. The 3 red dots are the first 3 deer that we found in 2012. And CWD has continued to increase in 2013, in 2014, 15, 16, and 17, which is the last year for which we have complete data. It appears we're currently observing the early stages of a CWD infection as it begins to pick up momentum, and we can look to other states to see what the future holds if we do not take action. So at this time, there are 2 options in how to respond to CWD in the study area. Option 1 is to do nothing and just document CWD as it increases and spreads to new areas. Unfortunately, the first 6 years of this outbreak are tracking the observations of West Virginia and Wisconsin. And given this, it's not unreasonable to think that in this area we'll see this continued increase in CWD infection, where in a decade or so we could see 25% of the animals infected. Option 2, on the other hand, is to take some action that has been shown to have an effect on CWD and make the effort to stop or slow the increase in spread to new areas. Given the available information, option 2 fits best with the Game Commission's mission to manage wildlife for current and future generations of Pennsylvanians, and to prevent Pennsylvania from continuing on its current path. Reducing deer abundance in CWD areas is the only option that has been shown to have an effect elsewhere. For example, in Colorado, they reduced deer populations in an area using hunting and targeted removals, and that does appear to have reduced the CWD outbreak in that area. As a result, the Game Commission is initiating a project involving deer capture and collaring, intensive deer population monitoring, increased hunting opportunities, and the use of wildlife professionals is needed to remove additional deer to reach population objectives in the study area. And it's important to note that hunters are being given the opportunity to help before using wildlife professionals to remove deer. Again, the purpose of this project is to evaluate the feasibility of deer population reduction and its impact on CWD and deer behavior. As part of this project, we are conducting field work that will provide information on deer population abundance and deer behavior. Our field crews have been capturing deer and placing GPS collars on them. These collars allow us to follow deer movements and monitor their survival. And in response to false information making its way around the internet, I would like to clearly state that we are not using nets to capture and kill deer. The nets are being used to capture deer for the research component of this project. In addition, collared deer will not be tracked down and killed. Once we have a collar on a deer, it is too valuable of an animal, both in terms of the resources to capture and collar it, as well as the information it provides for us to then pursue it a few months later and try and kill it. It is okay for hunters to harvest these deer during the hunting seasons. That's part of the research. But these animals will not be killed as part of the targeted removal. And also, it's important to mention that landowner permission to capture and collar deer does not mean that landowner has given us permission to go in and shoot deer later. Those are 2 separate activities, 2 different permission procedures. In addition to the capturing and collaring, we are conducting population surveys using infrared cameras at night. These counts will be combined with other data to estimate the deer population in the study area. And we'll use these surveys to determine the number of deer to be removed. As we've gathered public input on efforts to address CWD, a consistent message was that hunters wanted the first opportunity to help. As a result, we've provided hunters with a number of opportunities to help control CWD. First, within the study area, 3,000 DMAP permits were available to hunters during the recent hunting seasons. Second, the antlerless allocations in 2C, the western half of this study area, and 4A, the eastern half of the study area, were increased. And finally, we sent postcards to all DMAP permit holders in this area, encouraging them to use those permits as well as to submit the deer heads for CWD testing. In these ways, hunters were provided additional opportunities and encouraged to help us control CWD by increasing the antlerless harvest. Now that the hunting seasons have concluded, we're doing these surveys to estimate the deer populations, and based on that information, we'll implement the next action. After hunting seasons end, targeted removals will be used as needed to reduce deer abundance. We anticipate this occurring on about 25% of the study area. So as a result, we'll have that area where we have increased hunter harvest plus targeted removals. Most of that study area will only have the hunting component. There will be no targeted removals. Ideally, hunter harvest would be the only action that we would be using. However, targeted removals can help reduce deer populations more quickly, and time is the important component here. And it's for this reason that targeted removals were chosen as we try to get ahead of CWD and the way it's increasing in this particular area. USDA will be conducting the removals using rifles at night. These wildlife professionals have extensive experience safely removing deer from highly developed areas and parks throughout Pennsylvania. Targeted removals will only occur on properties where landowners have given permission via a formal agreement. And the population goal after removal will be about 2,000 to 2,500 deer in the removal area. And a couple of points here to emphasize regarding those numbers. First, that's the population goal. That's not necessarily the number of deer that we're going to remove. The number of deer that will be removed will be dependent upon what we see in those post-hunt population surveys. It could be that number, it could be less, depending on what hunters have already harvested. Second, it's important to state that this is not an effort to eliminate deer in this area. There will be deer remaining in the removal area, obviously 2,000 to 2,500 of them. And by next fall, when you add in this year's fawn crop, there may be 3,000 or more deer left in that area. And then finally, just to give some perspective, what does 2,000 deer look like in an area? This goal is comparable to the average deer population of every state surrounding Pennsylvania. So it's not an effort to eliminate deer by any stretch. In closing, CWD is too serious for us to ignore. As much as we would all love to turn that clock back to the time before we saw CWD, we simply cannot ignore it and hope it goes away. We know CWD kills deer and elk. In studies in other states, survival rates of CWD-infected animals are about half those of healthy animals. These lower survival rates will reduce hunting opportunities. And as CWD spreads to more of the population, deer and elk populations can decline. It's also important to understand that this is a quiet disease in which the impacts are measured over years. Large numbers of dead deer are unlikely to be found, but all available information tells us those impacts are likely to occur. In Pennsylvania, CWD is increasing and spreading. Since 2012, in those first 3 infected deer, the number of CWD-infected deer has doubled every year, and today, 20 of our 67 counties right now are affected by our DMAs. From surveys of Pennsylvania deer hunters, we know that a majority of them, both in the disease areas as well as outside, have concerns about the impact of CWD on deer and deer hunting. And finally, research from elsewhere indicates that deer population reduction is the best action at this point to reduce the effect of CWD. And as a result, that's the course of action we're looking to take in Bedford and Blair counties. With that, be glad to answer any questions. Yes.
How many were processed? How many were used?
I don't know that right now. The reporting deadline for that is next week, so we won't have complete tallies on that. Last year in this unit, I think about 1 in 5 were used, but we'll have this year's later on.
One of the things that you said was in Colorado, they were using hunters and targeted shooting to reach their goal. And I think that's what our goal is here. And you know as well as I do is hunters always want the first shot.
Right.
So do you think you know, going out and talking to the hunting community, is that a way to kind of convince them that we're doing the right thing, is sell it as a combined effort between them and us, so that they know that we're not leaving them out? I mean, as soon as they hear the targeted, you know how it is.
Oh,
as
yeah.
soon as they hear targeted shoot, they go, oh,
Yeah.
you know, we're forgetting all about the hunter.
Yeah, I think the other thing that they hear is reduced deer numbers.
Well, of course they do.
And we know how that works. You know, this is a difficult one because, and similar to what Jared was talking about, I think one of the things we need to remember is, in order for any of this to work, unless we have a situation like Game Lands 87, where it was all game lands for the most part around that property, we have to go to the landowners. And in these situations, I think we have to have some concerns about their situation. If they're going to cooperate with us, that does potentially put them out there as well. So to some extent, maybe it's the deer biologist in me that's been dealing with this, you know, deer for all these years. I think some of it's going to occur. Whether we put it out there initially, then we're going to deal with it. You know, if we'd have put it out a month ago, we'd be dealing with it a month ago, and there would still be the misinformation. We'd still be responding. I think to some extent it might be 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in terms of which way is the best way to go. As soon as you say targeted removal and reduced deer numbers, we're going to get pushback. I mean, that's deer management.
Just seems that we could figure something. Maybe that's Steve's job. It's just
Sure.
find a more palatable, just a more palatable message. I mean, because as soon as you said that about Colorado, I thought, boy, that just sounds like it makes sense.
Well, they didn't like it either.
A combined effort between hunters and the agency.
And that's what we're doing. You know, I mean, the permits are out there. The permits are being purchased. The allocations in 4A, though, I don't think they were all purchased the last time I checked, which was maybe around flintlock season. I think there were still a couple thousand left in 4A. But those permits are there. They're being purchased. You know, some of them are being used. All those folks did get, if they bought a permit in that DMAP area, they did get a postcard. You know, short thing just saying, please do it, you know, use your tag and help. So I think we've made that effort. Could we have done more? Probably always. But yeah, I'm glad to pass that off to Steve.
Hunter has to step up a little bit in this situation too.
Yeah.
You know, and don't worry, we'll pass it off on this.
Okay. Good for me.
Chris,
Okay.
how do you get those deer numbers? Do you use drones to make those counts, or?
No, what we're doing is we're doing surveys from the road with infrared, so we can see, you know, we don't have to disturb people, and we can see those animals at night. And then it's called distance sampling, and basically what you're doing is you can take the angle of that animal from the vehicle, from the road, calculate distances from the road, and then the guys at Penn State that know a lot more about that type of stuff can give us a population estimate. But it's a distance sampling protocol, fairly common, has been used. I know they used it at Gettysburg with a graduate student down there. But it's a way that by driving those routes at night, it's more than just a minimum count at that point. We're getting an estimate of the population within that area. And we can also incorporate some of that GPS movement off the collars to factor that in as well.
From the biological perspective, Chris, and you're the expert, you know, the freons, and I don't know if this is factual, what I've read and been told, they lay in the ground. So this targeted removal, what does other states, you mentioned Colorado, and I think I heard New York in the discussion maybe yesterday or last night. Is there a pattern that it ultimately will come back yet? Is there any data out there for the latent, if that's the right word?
Yeah, I think one of the things, we'll take that Colorado study for example. They did see a drop in prevalence, but it was still there. It was, I think in that paper, it was around 8% before and about 4% after. If you look at Colorado's response plan now, and they've had it for decades, their response plan is right around a 5% prevalence level. So, and I may not be interpreting that correctly, but for them it seems like they're really keeping it below 5%. So this type of action, I would not expect at all or set those expectations that, and if we do this in 10 years, it'll be gone. It's probably going to be there. hopefully at a lower rate, as well as not as much of a spread to other areas. You know, there's two concerns here. One is that local area, and then the other one is surrounding areas and how vulnerable are they to this increasing pool of animals in this area. So we'd like to reduce that pool and minimize that spread.
Thank you.
Yes.
I guess that's feeds right into my question, Chris. So you showed two different graphs, one at about 25%, I think it was for Wisconsin, and I think West Virginia was up to about 35% prevalence rates. And I'm assuming that's within, for instance, if we were looking at DMA2, that would be the prevalence rate within DMA2 as an example. But what are they seeing in terms of this spread and the flyers? You know, are they kind of having the same experience as we are? Because I know they're just introducing elk right now in West Virginia, and yet you're saying they have 35% CWD. Like the two don't kind of make sense to me, so I'm trying to understand how much spread they get.
Right. Well, I think the Wisconsin one, whether it's spread from that particular area, I mean, certainly, I forget what, I looked at that percentage, but 55 of 72 counties are now affected in Wisconsin. That all didn't come from that core area, but they have seen that spread. It's interesting with West Virginia, where they found it, it's almost like they're more sharing it with Maryland and Virginia type of thing, or Maryland, you know, you could get into an argument with the guys from West Virginia over who's sharing it. But for them, we are seeing it spread, and you know, Virginia's picking up more. Maryland obviously is picking up more. You know, now Maryland has us on the north now with some higher numbers, so you know, we could all be sharing with Maryland. But we have seen that spread from both of those areas, and I mean, just about every state you look at, even except for the Minnesota, or I think Minnesota early on. I mean, they now have it as well. In the New York example, are really, they may be the only two where small, a handful of animals, and it seems like it worked. But you look at all the other states where they're finding multiples. I think we just saw an article last week. Tennessee is up to 62. Tennessee's at 62 positives already. We know the Arkansas, I mean, they were up close to 200 within a year, those sorts of things. So, I mean, we can only go with what we know and what we've seen. I mean, I would be the first to admit there's a lot of uncertainty with this disease, but what we see is not encouraging.
But it does seem like the combined idea of trying to control it within the known DMAs and then trying to wipe out the flyers. I mean, we're doing the best we can at that point.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, just a question on the other area. You have a chart that's up to 75 in the Bedford CWD area. What's going on with the one closer to the elk?
That would be one of those locations up there. Right now, there's 3 positives that we know of in DMA3.
One of them that we already shot around
Game lands 87, and then a couple. Are both of those in the top 3 or 4? I don't recall.
So there's 2 additional positives in DMA3, and one's number 1 priority and one's number 3. So we'll probably go in tandem with those because they're so close. We'll be shooting, well, plan is to shoot at the same time the number 2, which is in DMA3, and 1 3 at the same time.
Thank you.
With Delaware being so close to Maryland and Maryland having it, do we know if Delaware is proactive in doing any testing?
Yes, they're doing testing. The Maryland positives, though, they are on that western part, so you still have that eastern shore, potentially the Chesapeake Bay, but certainly they could go across the northern part. But yes, as far as I can recall, all of the states in our area are testing.
They are testing.
Yep.
I'd hate to see it come into that area and then come up, because then
Right.
we're in trouble.
Yeah, it'd be
Not that we're not in trouble now,
Right.
but then
It'd be
you're
closer to
where
home.
it's over.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, Executive Office. All of you know me, but for any of the public that's watching, my name is Jeremy Banfield. I'm the elk biologist of the Game Commission. This is going to be a review of seasons that we proposed actually back in August. This is the first time the board saw this at the working group meeting there. and it will literally be a review of that, just kind of a reminder before the April meeting. So current elk season that we have now is the first full week of November, 6-day season, followed by an extended season. And the biggest distinction between those is that the general season is within the elk management area, and then the extended season is outside the elk management area. No elk have ever been killed in that extended season. And what we're going to propose shifting to, or at least adding in, is an additional archery season the last part of September, so the last 2 weeks of September, followed by the regular general season the first full week of November as it is now, and then followed by a late antlerless only or cow only season in early January. And the breakdown of each one of those seasons, so the archery season again would be late September. It'd have a very low number of tags, at least initially, and it'd be specific to certain hunt zones. And when I say that, I mainly mean that we would avoid a lot of the main viewing areas, so we'd stay away from zones 2, 6, and 8, which surround Zone 7, which is that Benezet and the visitor center area. And we would check the animals in the field, so we wouldn't have a check station the way that we do during the general season because of the low number of tags. We would simply check them in the field the same way that we do bear for archery now, archery bear. Basically the same general season as we have now. Biggest difference would be that we would peel some of the tags from that season and put them into the late season. So that would be in any weapon season, again, first full week of November. I'll say for now that 70% of the, or greater than 70% of the tags would remain in that season. We would still do a check station for checking the animals. And then the remainder, so that other 30%, we could possibly put into this late season. And that's going to take some experimentation to see what the right ratio there is. But this would be similar to the general season, so we'd have any weapon, again, the early part of January. And because it would have a lower number of tags, we would stick with the field checks for that one as well. Main motivations for doing these 3 seasons, or the 2 additional seasons, one is to reduce crowding, and the prime example there would be Zone 2. So we had 27 tags in Zone 2 this year. Again, that's over a 6-day season. That's a lot of people to put into a 6-day window. Elk are a herding species, so you often have situations where numerous hunters are all focused on one group of elk, and that obviously has human safety issues. And so the idea there is that splitting those tags out and putting in some of them into an additional season would reduce crowding. The other big one that we've all been talking about here is obviously CWD, so this would provide a structure to control CWD when it does strike. Unfortunately, that is an inevitability. It's either going to come across from DMA-3 or potentially DMA-2. The other possibility is that it could spill out from a captive facility. So within the elk management area, there's currently 27 captive facilities. If we create a 15-mile buffer around that, that adds another 62. So within 15 miles of the elk management area and itself, that's 87 captive facilities combined. Another added benefit here would be increased flexibility in mitigating some elk-human conflicts. So just some quick information on that. The bulk of our conflicts are occurring right around the fall rut. Our elk season is after that, and so by including that early season and then potentially that late season in January, we'd be able to address some of these elk-human conflicts when they're actually happening. And then the last thing I'll comment on is just reducing habituation. So this goes without saying, but reducing habituation would obviously improve some of the human safety concerns. These are just pictures I stole off of Facebook. But there's somebody's like 7-year-old kid standing about 10 feet from an elk. That's a clear, doesn't even need to be mentioned, but that's a human safety issue. And then somebody else is sitting by a campfire with a big bull right next to them. So reducing habituation would improve some of the potential for elk actually physically attacking people or something like that. When that does happen, naturally the elk is the one that generally suffers, and so reducing habituation would also have a benefit to animal welfare. We have gone out and asked the hunters what they feel about this. So 2017 Elk Hunter Survey, that's a survey that goes out to the elk hunters themselves after the hunt, and you can see the numbers there. 73% were in favor of the archery season, 77% were in favor of the late antlerless only season. And we also asked a greater pool of just the applicants, so these would be not people that have drawn an elk tag and participated in the hunt, but people that have shown interest in the elk hunt through applying for it. Similar numbers again, 79% for the archery season, 69% for the late cow season. And then on top of that, we did this again this year. So the 2018 elk hunters, we repooled them, asked them the same questions, again, 68% and 74%. So I didn't do averages on that, but you can see that there's tremendous support for both of these seasons. Other potential benefits here, this could improve the odds. It's tough to actually tell if this is going to happen or not, but we have over 30,000 people that put in for that general season right now. Theoretically, some portion of them are going to peel off and go to either one of these seasons, and that would reduce the overall pot, which could improve the odds for that general season and have lower, or excuse me, better odds for the archery in the late season as well. And then just increasing hunter opportunity. You all know this, but time consistently is one of the limiting factors for retaining hunters and recruiting new hunters. So anything that I think contributes to hunter opportunity is a positive thing. Last time I did present this to the board was in August, and at that time Commissioner Daly had asked me about the potential of adding muzzleloaders or flintlock into that early archery season. Just to address that this time, I did go and basically polled the other states, that have elk, including eastern and western states, to see who has exclusive muzzleloader seasons. Do those seasons include archery? Do they not? And then what kind of success rates are we talking? So we went out to 17 different states. I basically emailed my counterpart in 17 different states. Most of them do not have exclusive muzzleloader seasons, but 3 do: Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico. All of those do include archery as well. And then the success rates range there. And it's tough for us to look at those and compare that to Pennsylvania simply because the scale is so much greater. We're talking 10,000 tags versus a few hundred tags or 800 tags here. But you can see some of the success rates there. Those are higher than what we would expect for archery. So basically my conclusion would be if the board decides to include muzzleloader or flintlock with that early archery season, we'd probably end up having to peel tags off the general season and split it out that way. And with that, I will take any questions on any of that.
Commissioner Daly.
Yeah.
Thanks for looking at the muzzle loaders, because I do think that we as a commission should be looking at all our hunters, not just bow. But this, not too long ago, Jeremy, I think you determined that our elk are mating essentially during the second estrus cycle, correct? Or many of them are.
A portion of them are, yes. So we do have some.
So with timing of the season, even our general rifle season, the 70% versus the 30%, would timing of the seasons help that scenario in any way? Is it competition for bulls or cows, or is there anything else that we could do biologically? We're always told, follow the biology, follow the science. So if that's what's happening, what would that tell us about timing of seasons, if anything?
Okay, just so I'm clear on what you're saying, because we're seeing some symptoms of late breeding, your question is, could we adjust the hunting season to improve that in one direction or the other?
Right.
Okay.
And I don't know which way you'd move it, but yeah.
I mean, potentially yes, but you're talking about such a small number of animals. Our bull to cow ratio is relatively high, right? So we're at about 33, 34 branched bulls per 100 cows. A lack of mature bulls being able to breed all of those cows is not one of our problems.
Yeah, but could it be competition between too many bulls?
It could be, and we do see some bull-related mortality, right? Combat-related mortality. I don't think that's going to be a huge contributing factor to this. I think it's some other root cause that's related to it. So given the number of tags that we're putting into each one of these seasons, I don't think that's going to have a strong effect on the breeding success one way or another.
Hoover.
How many accidental bull kills would you anticipate during the late season?
During the archery season? Or
During the late season.
the late season would be antlerless only.
Right.
So how many accidental?
Bull kills. I mean, at what point do we lose? At what point are most of the racks dropped?
March. It would be well before. Okay. Yeah, most of so whitetails.
You see some in the deer.
Correct. Whitetails are mostly in January. Elk, it's almost, very seldom in the last week of February. Really, like the first 2 weeks of March is when you start seeing all those drops. So during that season, everybody should still have their antlers. I wouldn't expect any to be accidentally killed during that season.
Any other questions? All right.
Thank you.
Jeremy. Mark Turnett.
Yes.
We're going to talk bear management.
Okay. So let me give a report on black bear populations and results of the 2018 hunting season. Of course, tagging is something I always start out with every year. Our tagging program is one of the cornerstones of our monitoring program. This past year, we had 731 bears tagged statewide. We had 22 of those bears that were died before the hunting seasons. Most of those were vehicle collisions. Left us 709 bears going into the hunting season. How does that compare to prior years? We were actually down a little bit, about 150 to 200 bears below what we normally would tag. And so this will be something we'll want to try to improve on in the coming year because of some of the proposals we're going to be talking about here in a few minutes in terms of changes to the hunting season. So I just want to put out there, we had 731 bears tagged. We did have a few counties where tagging was down enough that it would impact the estimates that we produce in those management units. Again, some of those units are extended season hunting units, and with the proposals we have coming up, this will be another place where we'll want to focus some tagging effort in the coming year so that we have some good data in those areas coming up next year. But what did we learn from the tag data this year? We had a statewide bear population estimate. Our mark recapture estimate comes in at 19,400 bears. I think it's important to note that that estimate's nearly identical to the last 3 to 4 years. So we feel pretty comfortable right now saying we have 20,000 bears statewide and that population is stable at the moment. If we look at other indices that we track, it's telling the same story. Vehicle mortality and human-bear conflicts, the number of problems we have with bears, have both also stabilized the last few years. So I think we're very comfortable in saying we have 20,000 bears at the moment, that the population hasn't really changed and gone up much in the last 2 or 3 years, and that we're right at 20,000 bears statewide. So from 20,000 bears, what type of hunting season did we have? Well, we harvested 3,153 bears, spread across those 4 seasons. You can see the general season, we had a little over 2,000 bears. The extended season, 699, the archery, 424, and our early season, 13. That ranked 11th, and it was actually down 285 bears from 2017 and down 453 bears from the predicted trend. You can see there's a kind of a dotted line would be the trend line. And so 2018 was an off year for bear hunting, and in fact, the last 2 years, 2017, 2018, both had below average harvest. And I think that will come up again here in a few minutes when we talk about season proposals for 2019. We actually have had now 2 off years, and 2018 being off noticeably. If you look at kind of 6-year data points from 6 different years, you can see that the general season, we were actually a little bit better than 2017, but still off by a good 500 bears from where we normally would be. In the extended season, we were down. We had been having an increasing trend in the extended season harvest. 2017, we harvested over 1,000 bears in the extended season. We dropped down to 699 in 2018. And then in the archery season, they were similar. You know, what we saw this year was very close to what we saw a year ago. And so that is good news. You know, we've now had 2 years with archery bear hunting in the archery deer season. So it's good to see that we're comfortable in saying we get 400 to 500 bears from that archery season now. And that number will come up here again in a minute. But I think it's important to point out that the off year we had this year and in 2017 was not due to lack of opportunity. I think we could have killed 4,000 bears this year or last year, but we didn't because of bad luck with some weather events. And I think that really shows itself when you look at the harvest by day. Let me back up here. Well, that 2017 line, that's what the archery season generally starts out on Monday and then would increase with a peak on the last day. Well, you can see on 2018, we started out like that, but it really dropped off the last couple days. Again, we had a big weather event come in, and that ended up causing a 100-bear decline in our archery harvest. A single weather event towards the end of that week, suddenly we were off by 100 bears. The same thing happened in the general season. This is what a general season harvest typically looks like. We start out high on Saturday, steady decline out to the last day. You remember back in 2017, we were way off on the first day. That's when we had that torrential rains across the state in 2017 on opening day. And what we saw was a opening day harvest that was the lowest we'd had in decades. But what happened, though, is that rebounded. In 2017, we were back to above average on Monday, and we were able to post a decent harvest that year. But in 2018, of course, we were off on the opening day because of the snowstorm that came the day before bear season. We had 12 to 15 inches of snow over most of the northern range. But unlike 2017, we didn't bounce back by the second day. That snow was still out there. Hunters had a hard time getting into the woods, hard time getting out on the roads and into the woods to hunt. And so we ended up being off by almost 600 bears because that below average weather event or harvest that was caused by a weather event persisted all the way into the last day of the season. And the same thing happened again in the extended season. I don't know, generally our extended season kill, we have a good opening day, and then we have another increase on Wednesday when those 4-day units open, and then we have a big peak on the last day. Well, in 2018, we started out low. I know if you remember what it was like on the opening day of deer season, I know where I was at. It was a lousy day to be out, and that happened. That was our opening day of our extended bear season, and we ended up being off by over 300 bears just because of that. So I think collectively, those just kind of bad luck with weather in each of our seasons kept us short 1,000 bears this year in the harvest. So, the inability to harvest 4,000 bears isn't due to opportunity. It's certainly not due to hunters either. This year, we posted 174,000, almost 175,000 bear licenses sold. We were 445 short of setting a new record. So we continue to see this increasing trend in license sales, and actually had a lot of bear hunters out there at least purchase a license this year. We just had a little bit of bad luck with the weather. And so moving into what happened with harvest at the management unit scale, these graphs all represent harvest trend, and most of them fell to where we were comfortable with, but I want to bring your attention down to 6 units here. We had 6 units, and these are all core units. They're all high-density bear units. They're parts of the core bear range. We had 3 of them, 2 in the north central, 2 at 2G, 1 down in the southwest, 2C, that have now had 2 consecutive years of what we would consider below average harvest. They were down in 2017 and 2018. We also have 2 units up in the northeast part of the state that saw a dramatic decline in 2018 harvest. Not only below average, but also quite a drop from 2017. So this will come up here in a minute again when we talk about season proposals. I just want to point out that we did have 5 management units that have now had either 1 or 2 years of below average harvest. And at that level, and we know that it was not due to low bear populations. It was actually low harvest rates. And this is harvest rates for those 5 units from this year. And when you harvest bears at a rate of 12 to 14 or 18%, you will eventually have an increase in the bear population in those units. And so that's something I think we want to avoid. And being that these are core units to the bear range, you'll see that we got some significant proposals coming up. So what are those proposals? What are we talking about for bear hunting in 2019? Well, right now we have currently 3 seasons: 6 days of archery, 4 days of general hunting, and 4 to 6 days of extended hunting. That gives us 14 to 16 days of bear hunting in the primary bear range. And I'm not including 5B, C, and D, and Unit 2B that have the early season. But in our core area, that's what we currently have. So we're talking about, first off, adding a muzzleloader special firearms season, 7 days, including 2 Saturdays. This would be concurrent with the same season that's available for deer hunting. So 7 days of muzzleloader and 3 days of special firearms season that would fall within that week. What that looks like is a reference. You can see there in the gray that traditional bear season this year will be the 23rd to the 27th of November. So we're talking about a season that will start 4 weeks prior to that, 19th to the 26th. This would be the earliest that we've ever hunted bears in really modern time in Pennsylvania with a bear season. And one of the benefits that we might experience from that would be taking bears closer to areas where we have crop damage. The earlier we hunt bears, we might have an opportunity to kill a few bears actually in areas where there's crop damage occurring. But it will be an early season. How many bears might be taken in a season like that? Well, we don't really know. We don't have a lot of baseline data for a bear season in early October. But what we do know, we have a little bit of information on deer hunter numbers. And we know that right now we have about 65,000 deer hunters that participate in the muzzleloader season and about 25,000 in the special firearm season. About a third of those right now currently buy a bear license. And so, using typical hunter success rates for bear hunters, we might expect anywhere from 400 to 700 bears in that season. But these predictions do not account for any changes in hunter behavior or license buying. It's just kind of a general guess at where we might start at. I think in that range, though, we'd be comfortable, and so that's why we've moved ahead with that proposal. I think it's interesting also to point out that deer hunter numbers in both of those seasons have had a slight downward trend the last couple of years. So it will be interesting to see what happens to the deer hunter numbers when we add a concurrent bear hunting opportunity that week. We're also talking about some changes to the extended bear season. First off, we're talking about adding a Saturday opener to all extended season units. This would be to align the proposal to have rifle deer season open on a Saturday. Initially, this wasn't something we had thought about. It was just kind of got added in at the last minute so that we have seasons that all align with the same opening date. Of all the changes that we're proposing for bear this year, if I had to pick one that I would drop, this would probably be the first one, just because it wasn't something that was really on our radar to begin with, but it's out there because of the season alignment. So if the proposal to open Saturday with deer doesn't go through, we would go with a Monday opener for extended bear. But on top of that, we're also talking about adding 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, to 8 management units that currently have a 4-day extended season. So right now we have a 4-day extended season and a 6-day extended season. So the proposal is to make that the same season across all 16 management units, or all 12 management units in the core range. So that would be either a Monday to Saturday or a Saturday to Saturday, depending on what happens to that opening day. So as a reference, it would look something like this, either the 30th to the 7th or the 2nd to the 7th of December. And that will probably account for, I figure, a few hundred bears, 200 or 300 bears possibly in those 2 extra days. And then finally, we're talking about changes to the archery bear season. Now, right now in the proposal that you're going to vote on tomorrow, we have it worded such that we would move the archery bear season into that new muzzleloader bear season, muzzleloader special firearms. And I'll give you a little bit of background, so it would look something like this. I'll give you a little bit of background on how that proposal got developed. Back in October, when we were tossing around the idea and talking to region staff about a muzzleloader bear season, there was interest from the regions to allow archery hunting in that same week. They thought it would be beneficial to hunters if they could go out that week and hunt with either archery, muzzleloader, or special firearms that same week. When we were having these discussions back in October, the problem is that if we went with that and kept the current archery bear season that we have, we would end up with a split season. We would have a week of archery bear hunting and then a week closed and then a reopen another week. And that was something we didn't really want to do. We didn't want to have a season that was broken up. And the other thing is we hadn't seen the 2018 harvest yet, so we didn't know if we could support a 2-week archery bear season. So the compromise is that we moved what would be our last 2 years of archery bear hunting, we moved that into the muzzleloader season. So that's a proposal that you'll have on your agenda for tomorrow. But as an alternative, now that we've had a chance to see the 2018 season, I just want to mention one possible alternative to this now that we've got a little more information, and just something to think about before tomorrow. And that is, if you look at the season we've had the last 2 years, that seems to have worked out really well. If we make this change and move the season, we will have moved the archery season 3 times out of the last 4 years. And so I think there is some benefit to keeping a season consistent. It's certainly from a data perspective, it's a lot more easier to interpret. So if we kept that season that we have right now, the 4th through the 9th, we could potentially make that a 2-week season and just take archery bear hunting out of the muzzleloader season. And so that is something to think about. Now that we've seen the harvest results from 2018, I think we would be comfortable supporting a 2-week archery bear season. And in that scenario, I think it would address some of the concerns we've had from archery hunters We just didn't know back in October what that season was going to look like. But I do want to keep in mind that we want to continue to avoid the last week of the archery deer season, that 7th week there. That is the most popular week. That is when close to 25% of the deer harvest occurs. And just to avoid conflict with that group of hunters, what we're talking about is the second to last week and the third to last week. I think we now know that we can harvest 400 to 500 bears in that second to last week. We're probably looking at how participation is a little lower the week before. We'd probably would guess a prediction around 300 bears, somewhere in that neighborhood. So, you know, what that would look like is we would use that week in between for an additional 6 days of archery bear hunting. Now, if all of these proposals, you got to keep in mind that this will be the largest and most diverse and wide affecting set of bear proposal changes that we've made really in modern times. You know, to expand bear hunting in all 3 seasons. In fact, if you look at it right now, we're talking about, we currently have 14 to 16 days. We're talking about adding 17 to 19 days, which means we're talking about more than doubling season opportunity for bear hunting. In terms of harvest goals, where do we want to go with that? This is what the seasons would look like. We would start hunting bears in middle of October, and we'd hunt them till early December with a week and a half, 2-week break right before the traditional season. But in terms of harvest goals, where do we want to go with this? Right now, we're around 2%. We have 174,000 bear hunters, 20,000 bears. 2% success, they shoot around 3,500 bears most years. That's about 18% removal. We've been below that the last 2 years. I think where we want to go is a little closer to 3%. In that 4,000 to 4,500 bear range, in that 20 to 25% removal, I think we would be more successful at keeping a stable bear population. I think if we don't move in that direction, we're going to see another jump in our bear population here in a few years. What we want to avoid, though, is going too far, up to that 4 or 5% success rate. And so we want to stay around 2.5%, 3%, or maybe not just shy of 3%. I think these proposals you're going to get will accomplish some of that. A lot of it's unknown. We simply just don't know. We don't have a lot of baseline information on some of these changes. But we're willing to give it a try and see what happens. And fortunately, we have a very good system here in Pennsylvania for monitoring what happens with bears in our state. We have a statewide bear tagging program and, of course, a check station program that gives us a lot of information, and I think we can come back a year from now and tell you how close we are to that 3% goal or if we overshot, and we can make adjustments at that point. But this will be a very significant package of changes for bear hunting, and so it'll be up to the agency to dedicate the resources and make a commitment to getting a sample of bears tagged and getting every bear this year checked in the harvest. And with that, I think, any questions?
Couple questions. I'm not real fond of adding another rifle season into the archery season. Have you discussed or thought about a muzzleloader early firearm season in September when the bear are doing the most damage to crop?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about even an earlier season. Yeah, I mean, we could think about that. I think the reason it ended up in the deer season was to have benefit from the number of deer hunters that are out there. I think if you had just strictly a muzzleloader season in September, the cost to administer a season like that with checking bears and the effect it would have on having to stop our tagging program a month earlier, I don't know if we would get the harvest we need to meet some of our harvest goals. I think if you have it concurrent with the deer seasons that are occurring there, you're going to already have more hunters on the landscape, and you're likely going to have better participation. That's just my first reaction to the question.
Right. So I think that I believe United Bow Hunters came out. They're not they're against that proposal, adding a firearm season in the archery season.
They don't want to have their archery season at the same time.
Oh, at the same time as theirs. Yeah.
And we've
Well,
addressed
that would be the same thing.
Yeah, we fixed that.
We're gonna close archery season.
Well, they had offered to close. They talked about actually closing archery for that week, and then moving archery season later. So they would have a split season, you know, an early archery season and a later archery season that ran deeper into the November timeframe. I'm not sure how that would lay out, but
Actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but you already showed that. You showed a proposal where it would be the next to the last week for archery, as well as the third to the last week for archery as an alternative. Right. And that would keep them archers only without firearms during their season, correct?
Yeah, I think now that we know what happened in the 2018 season, I think that's a viable option. Yep.
That's the October 28th through November 2nd season. Correct. So, and just to be clear, if something happens that we overshoot your 3% goal, we can always peel this back next year. You know, reduced seasons, reduced harvest.
Yeah, that's the point of my closing slide, is that we have, you know, I'd argue the best monitoring program in the country in terms of understanding what's going on with our bear population. And so we'll know a year, and we'll know in January. I mean, we don't have to wait 6 months for the harvest data. We'll know a year from now what happened with these seasons. And at that point, if we need to make adjustments, we can.
That's the one great thing about the bear seasons is we adjust them just about every year anyway, to some degree.
But this is a large package. This is a big one. We're talking about.
I'm surprised to see you come up with this.
Well, I mean, I think it's inevitable. I mean, we every year we get season proposals from the regions that are asking for larger harvest. Yeah. We get hunters that are asking for a larger harvest. We get the board asking for a larger harvest. So I think this is a way to accomplish it where I think everyone is at least comfortable starting out.
Great. Any other questions, comments? Great.
Yep.
You guys okay? You need a break? Need a break? Keep going? Okay. No, we're good. Just okay. I'll go quick. Just seeing if the old guys need a break, Matt. You know how it is.
If it's Matt, I'm leaving.
Okay, well, as always, thank you for this opportunity to provide you with a few updates on our Furbearer management program. Today I'll touch on where we're at with our ongoing bobcat harvest season, what we learned from the 2018 fisher trapping season, and I'll touch on a few other Furbearer related issues as they relate to items on your agenda tomorrow. Of course, our bobcat harvest management program is guided by a comprehensive management plan. Hard to believe, but that plan will be up for revision in just a few more years. And we've learned a lot in the last 7 or 8 years about how to manage this important resource. That plan not only guides our harvest management, but also kind of dictates the measures that we use to monitor changes in bobcat populations throughout the Commonwealth. And one of the methods that we rely on heavily is the use of reports from trappers who incidentally catch bobcats outside of the established trapping season. They report to us numbers and locations of bobcats caught and released each year. And as you look at these trends, they're really representative of changes in our management approach during this 20-year span. You know, under a period of protection, we saw these numbers increasing steadily across the Commonwealth to the point that they were catching and releasing over 1,000 bobcats each year. That was one of the founding factors, if you will, for our first bobcat season in 2000. As we slowly and incrementally increased the number of permits and participation in our bobcat trapping and hunting seasons, we saw populations increase at a rapid rate across the Commonwealth to where they were catching over 2,400 bobcats and releasing them each year. And as we've imposed a more liberal management or harvest management strategy, we've begun to see those numbers stabilize across the Commonwealth, suggesting that bobcat populations are stabilizing throughout the state. As we look at harvest under our current management approach, we've seen a slow and somewhat steady decline during the past 4 or 5 seasons in the total harvest statewide. Whereas we were once harvesting over 1,000 bobcats each year, the past few years we've been harvesting under 800. And those numbers have been falling slightly, but participation in those seasons has not. And in fact, if we look at the number of bobcats harvested per 100 permits issued, we're still issuing about 15,000 to 16,000 permits annually. Those numbers were slowly declining as well. And that's why in previous meetings we've had discussions about possibly the need to shorten seasons in future years, particularly if those trends were to accelerate. I'm pleased to report to you that as of last week, with still over a week of bobcat hunting to go, we've already exceeded last year's harvest totals. We had 618 bobcats reported as trapped in the Commonwealth, 136 as hunted, with new reports coming in each day. And again, we've got over a week to go in that bobcat season. And it's important to note that our trappers in Pennsylvania are capturing some magnificent animals. You know, our bobcats in Pennsylvania are the second largest subspecies in North America. Safari Club doesn't enlist or enroll records of trapped animals, only hunted animals, but that individual bobcat was reported, based on skull measurements, to would have been number 1 in PA and number 16 in North America. And so we've got a large and enthusiastic group of constituents out there hunting and trapping these animals. I don't know the weight on it, sorry. But so with what we know so far in this season, we can expect, or we can estimate, that we're going to harvest about 820 to 830 bobcats this year. And this may suggest some stabilization in that total harvest, but more importantly, in the harvest per unit effort, the success rates of our bobcat hunters and trappers with permits out there. So based on that, our bobcat season proposal mirrors what we've done in previous years. Provide those opportunities to all licensed fur takers in wildlife management units open to hunting and trapping. The dates are listed for you there. They're similar in length to what we've done in the past. One addition on your agenda for tomorrow is the inclusion of Wildlife Management Unit 4B, where numbers of incidental bobcat catchers have been increasing somewhat dramatically in recent years. In terms of fisher harvest management, we're also guided by a management plan, which is due for revision, which we're currently working on. We hope to have a revised plan for consideration to the board in spring or early summer of this year. Similar to what we saw with bobcats, we also track incidental fisher captures, animals that are caught and released in traps set for raccoons or foxes or coyotes throughout the state. And we've seen those numbers steady to increasing across the Commonwealth as well. And it's important to note that those trends have been stable to increasing as we've imposed a fairly conservative fisher trapping season here in Pennsylvania. In the last couple of years, we've seen those numbers begin to increase somewhat dramatically across the Commonwealth. In terms of total harvest, we've had kind of a little bit of a learning curve initially when we introduced this new season, a very different season from what our trappers were accustomed to. But over the past few years, we've seen the numbers of fisher trap fairly stable, between 400 and 500 animals during a given year. This past year's season was the highest reported to date, with 504 fisher actually reported in the state. And as we look at success rates of our fisher permit holders, we see that they are not declining. They're probably stable to increasing during most years, suggesting that that resource is readily available for harvest. And it's important to note that as we shifted from a 6-day season to a 12-day season, effectively doubled season length in 2016, we saw relatively little impact on overall harvest. We doubled the season length. We certainly didn't double the harvest. We know from our surveys of trappers that successful fisher trappers expend about 3 days of effort to capture their fisher. So having a much longer season doesn't increase harvest success rates. And that's important for us as we revise our fisher management plan, because it tells us that if we want to increase harvest of this Furbearer, the way to do it is through bag limits, to increase bag limits for individual trappers during that established season. And so that'll be one topic that'll be scrutinized and considered in the next revision of the plan. So overall, we harvested 504 fisher from that relatively short season, December 15th to the 26th. Harvest occurred within all 15 wildlife management units, and these are the top six highest units listed here. Wildlife Management Unit 1B continues to produce the highest harvest density of fisher anywhere in the Commonwealth, as it has during previous seasons. So our fisher trapping season proposal, again, is similar to what we've done in previous years in terms of season, timing, and duration. It is at this point to maintain a season bag limit of 1. And one addition to the season proposal you'll see in your agenda tomorrow is inclusion of Wildlife Management Unit 4A for similar reasons that we expanded the bobcat trapping area. This will build some consistency across the state in that in the south central, north central, northeast portions of the state, if you can trap a bobcat, you can now also trap a fisher in those units. So that will help us to simplify some of those regulations. Our 2019 river otter trapping season will be coming up in a couple of weeks. This is the 4th year of a very conservative harvest opportunity, the first of its kind in nearly 60 years in the Commonwealth, and we continue to monitor that harvest very closely. We look at previous years, we've been harvesting about 35 to 45 otters during that short window of time. It's a difficult time of year with water conditions and icing to trap river otters. That's somewhat by design to ensure a conservative harvest at that point, at some point. And our current harvest density is around 1 river otter being taken per 100 square miles, suitable habitat. That's certainly not impacting our sustainable river otter population at this time. You know, some of the methods we use to track river otter population are different than some of our terrestrial furbearers. Our trappers are very active and very good at avoiding incidental river otter captures when they're beaver trapping, and so that's not a good measure for us. But we look at other indices to track changes in populations. And on this map, the light blue to dark blue represent stable to increasing river otter populations as reported to us by our game wardens across the state each year. And we continue to track that year by year. We're currently imposing harvest in a very small segment of the state in units 3C and 3D. The reason we're there is that's kind of the traditional core area of river otter populations here in Pennsylvania, and also because we had extensive field work in those areas prior to the first season. We actually had on-the-ground river otter density estimates going into that first season. As we look to the future, based on our river otter management plan, we're looking for areas to expand and provide more opportunity. We're currently interviewing candidates to fill our Furbearer specialist position. One of their first priorities is to conduct some harvest feasibility assessments on these 5 wildlife management units. We suspect that these units have sustainable populations where we can provide some new opportunity. And I suspect particularly units 1A and 1B will rank fairly highly in that feasibility assessment. I'll note to you that just west of units 1B and 1A in Ohio and Ashtabula County, they're harvesting 5 river otters per 100 square miles area, whereas in the Northeast we're harvesting 1 river otter per 100 miles square area. So there's certainly potential for new opportunities, and we're exploring those potentials. But this year's recommendation for the 2020 river otter trapping season is consistent with what we've done the previous few years. We're starting to gain enough information about that season, and particularly the impacts of weather on that season, that I think going into next year we should look at possibilities for expanding the season length in those wildlife management units where we're trapping river otters. And so that'll be part of the assessment as well. And I'll wrap up today with just a few comments relative to your proposal to shorten the porcupine hunting season. As I think we're all aware, from the inception of this season, many of our conservation partners and even internally our own staff have voiced concerns about the potential impact of our hunting season on porcupine populations. This is a species with very low reproductive output. They only produce 1 offspring per year, and the survival of those offspring is very low. So if there is a species out there that's vulnerable to overharvest, this is probably a prime candidate for that. All we have to go on currently is harvest data, and our approach has been to kind of sit back and see what kind of information we get and try and work with that to assess the effects of the hunting season on our populations. We can look at the total harvest, and that harvest has been falling. It's fallen 50% in the last 3 years, whereas we were harvesting over 6,000 porcupines last year. We were under 3,000. Those numbers are difficult to interpret because it's difficult to look at harvest per unit effort or hunter effort. These animals are taken opportunistically, they're taken incidentally to other hunting, and so it's difficult to look at success rates or the number of days hunters are out in the woods hunting porcupines because it's an opportunistic take. So it's somewhat difficult for us to evaluate. We have proposed a shorter hunting season for porcupines. Whereas it previously was September to March, we proposed a mid-October date to an early February date. You know, we've maintained the same bag limits, and those bag limits have very little impact on the harvest. We know that 60% of our hunters report taking 1 porcupine during a given year. 75% or less take 2 or less. And so the bag limits don't limit overall harvest to a great degree. But the timing of that season is important to us because it would avoid hunting porcupines during their breeding season. Porcupines have a very unique breeding behavior. They call it a guarding behavior. And the breeding season occurs from mid-September to mid-October. During the breeding season, a female, as she comes into estrus, will be pushed high into the treetop by the male who stands below her on a branch and guards her against other male porcupines. And they stay in that tree for several days at a time. And so the point is they're very visible, they're vulnerable to harvest as they're breeding. And that's something we want to avoid, I think, given the reproductive limitations of this population of wildlife. And so this, I think, is an important first step for us. I hope you'll consider it as you vote on your agenda items tomorrow. And I think it moves us in the right direction, particularly in terms of working with our conservation partners and managing these resources. I think if there is a strong interest in hunting porcupines out there, we have the ability to manage them sustainably, and we can work towards that goal together. And with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
You alerted us, I don't know, maybe a year ago to the decline in muskrat populations.
Yep.
What's changed? Is it still happening, or is there any solutions? Do we know why? Anything like that?
Yeah, it's a big question. I often say it's the number one question in fur management today is what's happened with. I could go on for a half hour, but I'm not gonna. But it's a difficult question. I'll tell you, it's becoming a top research topic across the country, from the Midwest to the Northeast to the Southeast. We're playing our part here. We've got an active muskrat disease surveillance effort going on right now. We've been radio tagging muskrats, looking at survival rates. One of the prominent theories is that it's declines are tied to hydrology, flashiness of streams. That as streams become more flashy, rise rapidly, fall quickly, it causes muskrats to evacuate their dens or their bank runs and exposes them to greater predation risk. And so that's one of the theories that's being tested in a number of states, and we're part of that effort overall. And it's certainly ongoing. It's and has been going on for several decades. In fact, as we look at old reports here from biologists in the late 80s, they were alerting people to the fact that something was changing in our muskrat population, and they were right on track with changes in demographics and population declines they were seeing in the 1980s. So I don't have if I had the answer for that, I'd be in a better place, but it's certainly at least in the spotlight right now that a lot of people are starting to look at muskrats.
Thank you.
Do people actually hunt porcupines? Do people actually hunt porcupines?
Well, evidently they do based on our game take survey, because they report taking porcupines. Now, whether they actively go out and pursue porcupines, I would say there probably is a small contingent that does. There are, a small percentage of people on the game take survey each year that report taking 10 porcupines, and I'd have to think that they're actually pursuing those animals. There is some commercial value to porcupines.
Well, yeah, what do they do with them? What's the value?
Well, there's commercial value in terms of the sale of the guard hairs for ceremonial head reasons, and particularly sale of the claws, as they look similar to raptor claws, which are used in Native American ceremonies, but of course they can't use raptor claws these days. So there are some commercial aspects to it as well, but we've never done any type of survey work to know how much people hunt porcupines or what they do with them after they harvest them.
Well, in our 3C and 3D, trappers coming to me.
Turn your mic on.
With fishers.
Mm-hmm.
Can we up that or lengthen that season a little bit? They're saying they get a lot of accidental traps.
Okay,
fishers.
Okay, so
So they want, if we can up the bag limits, or don't you think contain it?
No, I think that's the next step, would be to look at a bag limit increase. We know that extending the season length isn't going to have a dramatic impact on harvest. We're starting to cap out the number of wildlife management units. Probably a few western units that will come in future years, but certainly the next management approach, given that fisher populations continue to increase, would be to increase the bag limit, and that's what some surrounding states have done, and we know it works.
Has anyone taken a look at the impact of road salt on the muskrat population? A lot of salt goes on the road, winds up in the creek.
Yeah, I don't know that specifically they've looked that fine-tuned. There's been a lot of contaminant work going on. The question was whether road salt has an impact on muskrat populations. Ohio did some contaminant work and actually found a lot of residues from commercial cleaners showing up in watersheds, potentially impacting muskrats, as well as some heavy metals work. We're in the process right now of trying to collect about 800 to 1,000 muskrat carcasses that we'll be going through, and contaminant work is part of that effort as well. And so it's a long list of things to look for. The challenge is tying the presence of those things in the environment to some physiological process or biological impact on a population. That's always the challenge with disease surveillance.
A lot of scouring on our streams that I see.
Yep, and that ties back to the flashiness of those streams. Yep.
Any other questions, comments?
All right, thank you.
I'm smiling. You haven't seen me smile in 3 years.
Been a long time.
Been a long time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our current grouse status and present a season recommendation here for 2019. And as you might expect, there's good news and there's bad news. So we're going to start with bad news because it feels so good when you stop pounding your head against the wall and you move on. So the first bad news, of course, is West Nile virus. You've probably heard by now that 2018 was a horrendous year for West Nile virus. If you tried to do anything outside of your home or your camp this summer, you know that mosquitoes were tremendous this year. This graph shows you the prevalence of West Nile virus from 2003 through 2017, and you can see it rises and falls. It's flashy, sort of as Matt said, based on weather characteristics. 2017, that last year on the graph, was a very bad year. Anything above that red line is a very bad year. And you can see we've had several of those over the last really 7 or 8 years. But 2017 was exceptionally bad, as was 2012. The final numbers aren't in yet, but it appears that 2018 will exceed 2012, 2017, and may actually dwarf them when the final numbers come in. Just for some perspective, that shows you the table of mosquito pool positives for those 3 years I'm talking about. As of mid-July in 2012, DEP had found 262 positive pools of mosquitoes. Last year in 2017, the same time they found 53. This year in 2018, by mid-July, they had found 293 positive. They were drowning in red at that point. Human cases follow kind of a similar pattern. 2012, previously record year, had 60 human positives recorded across the state. 2017 had 20, and 2018 had 115. So that just gives you a little bit of perspective on how this last year ranked out. When DEP gave me this information in mid-July, mid-August, I reached out to our grouse cooperators through email, and I said, if we are ever going to find dead grouse in the woods, this is going to be the year we find it. So please keep an eye out as you're out there. Within a couple of weeks, we had a half dozen dead grouse turned into us. 2 of those were roadkills, and the other 4 were West Nile virus. So 2/3 of the birds that we had turned in were cause of death would have been West Nile virus. Those birds, the way they presented themselves in the woods is people were just finding them dead with no obvious damage. Just a dead bird laying in the woods, or they would be walking along with the bird dog, and the bird dog would retrieve a bird as they were taking a walk in the woods. So that's sort of how these birds were showing up. We have no idea how many dead grouse were in 2018, but these indications, tell us that this was probably a very high impact year for grouse. That's the bad news. Moving on to what I am hanging on to as the good news are our fall and winter index, this flushes per hour. Knowing what we knew about the summer of 2018, I didn't know what to expect with this hunting season. I fully expected that we may have just gone off a cliff this year. That little green dot that I'm hanging my hat on shows that 2018 leveled with 2017 and was just a slight reduction from 2016. So it appears, this is preliminary data, this is data that came in off the mobile phone app that hunters were able to submit real time. So we're going to adjust this as we get all the paper copies, but preliminarily, it looks like our fall-winter population index held its own this year. You can't believe the relief when I looked at that data. Similarly, our summer sighting survey, which looks at adult grouse and broods through the summer, and this is not preliminary data, this is final data. The summer of 2018, those numbers seem to hold their own. Almost exactly even with 2017 and just a slight reduction from 2016. So I'm taking this as a win. We haven't had a win for a while, so I think we should take it when we get the opportunity. The question is, and the question I get from hunters now, as they were seeing more birds this hunting season, they want to know if shortening the season has made a difference. Are we actually seeing a response or a benefit from the action that the board has taken? They want to know if we've bottomed out and now we're going to stabilize or start to recover. We all want to know that too. The problem is, it's still too soon to say. You know, I say I'll take this as a win, but we don't know if this relates to what we've done with the grouse season. It is keeping in line with what we would have hoped to see when we made that season reduction, but really we're going to need a couple more years to kind of keep an eye on what's going on here. There are other signs of good news. This shows you all of our neighboring states here in the Mid-Atlantic and the 3-year decline they had experienced between 2015 and 2017. Those declines are significant, but if you look where Pennsylvania stands, you see that we're in pretty good shape relative to our neighbors. And note also, 2015, 16, and 17, that was before we made any season adjustment. I think this is wholly a testament to the active habitat management that we're doing for grouse and that we have done as a state for grouse consistently. This is that long-term buffer that we have built ourselves as we've built good grouse habitat. So that's long-term how we're going to dig out from under a disease, and the proof is in the pudding in how we rank out relative to other states. I think it's important to keep in mind that when we shortened the season, made that reduction, eliminated that late season, and instituted that framework, we did it because we were a state that still had time to make a difference. We still had enough birds to work with. And that's really what this reinforces. So even though we are very alarmed about what's happening with our grouse in Pennsylvania, our hunters are very alarmed, I think it's important to remember, relatively, we are in good shape and we are the state that should be doing this and trying to see if we can turn the ship around here. So my season recommendation for 2019-2020 is to hold the course. It's a traditional October, November, December season, a closed late season, no season after Christmas, both in the northern and the southern part of the state, and it's a 2-bird daily bag limit. Grouse held steady this year, and I think we need to hold steady also and see if this framework is making a difference. I know this is not good news for grouse hunters to have another year of a closed post-Christmas season, and I want to thank them for giving us the benefit of the doubt and for being patient as we try to turn this ship around. The past 2 years, we've had nearly 400 public comments. 70% were supportive that first year, 76% were supportive the second year. So grouse hunters have hung with us. They trust us to be trying to do the right thing here. So I think we do owe them a debt of gratitude. You hear me talking about the framework, and you guys know this because we talked a lot about this last year, but basically we look at abundance, production, and disease as factors that help guide how we set the season. When all those numbers are great, we would have a 4-week post-Christmas. When they're in the moderate zone, we would have a 1-week late season. And when the numbers are bad, we would have a closed late season. So that's a consistent, transparent process that hunters can count on, that is science-based, and it's also responsive to grouse. As grouse populations come up, opportunity gets expanded. So it's a solid system. It's very similar to what we use for some other game birds at the federal level, and also what we do for some other game species in Pennsylvania. So here's where it brings us. In the northern management zones, think of that as north of I-80. We are at low abundance, we're at low production, and that results in a closed late season, regardless of West Nile virus, because the grouse numbers in this case are speaking for themselves. In the southern management zone, we're in the same situation, low abundance, low production, closed late season. If anyone is interested in knowing how I separate low, medium, and high, a bad year, a moderate year, a good year, these decision thresholds are worked out and they're available on the website, so anybody can go take a look at those. But you can see those current values on the right-hand side. We're all in the red zone, area of concern for this year. So a question that I'm getting quite a bit, and I'm sure you are too, is there any benefit in lowering the bag limit at this point? Hunters want to know, is there anything more we should be doing right now? The data would indicate no. I do not think the data supports a lowering of the daily bag limit, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. If you look at this chart, these are our hunter cooperators. Only 2 to 4% of their days of field result in hitting bag limit. So 96 to 98% of their days of field, they're harvesting no grouse or 1 grouse. Further limiting that 2 to 4% of days of field is not going to make a population level impact for grouse. However, it does reduce opportunity. So we run the risk of reducing opportunity without really creating a benefit to wildlife. And when I say it reduces opportunity, I'm especially thinking about the person who gathers the dogs, gathers the gear, heads up to another part of the state to hunt grouse, and they connect with a grouse by 9 o'clock in the morning. Under a 1-bird bag, their day is done. Under a 2-bird bag, they can continue to hunt the rest of the day, even though the data shows that they're probably not going to get that second bird. But they still have the opportunity to spend the day in the grouse woods. Focusing on season length rather than bag limit also aligns with the social data that we have. In 2015, we surveyed grouse and woodcock hunters. We had more than 2,000 people answer this question. We said, if we have to change the season based on grouse numbers, would you prefer we change season length or bag limit? And of those who had an opinion, 60% said season length. So I think the track that we're on, it's supported by the biological data. It's also supported by our social data. The other question I'm hearing, and I'm sure you are too, is should we reduce the season at a different part of the year? Should we reduce the fall season, October, November, December? I have so many options that are sent to me by grouse hunters. You know, why don't we do it this way or do it that way? The reason we focus on that post-Christmas late season is that is the season that's most likely to be additive. It's most likely to be impacting our breeding population. The reason for that are things that we've talked about already. The birds that are harvested in January have already survived the rigors of winter to date. They're just 8 to 12 weeks away from courtship and reproduction. There is high mortality during January to March. That period of winter is the highest period of mortality. So bringing more birds into that period should help us get closer to that goal of getting more birds through that breeding period. Even though that season of the year is the highest for mortality, they still have a pretty high monthly survival rate. January to March, monthly survival is 80 to 90%. This is based on data that just came out of Maine in 2016, where they don't hunt in January. So 80 to 90% of those birds that are protected from harvest in January, they have an 80 to 90% monthly survival rate getting into that courtship period. So that's why I say that that season is the most likely to be additive. The same thing can't be said about birds that are harvested in October or November. Avoiding the harvest of birds in the fall doesn't confer the same level of benefit in recruiting birds into the breeding population. They haven't yet survived winter. Those fall birds have not been through the food shortage, the predation pressure, the weather impacts that they're going to be faced with in the winter. So you quickly get into this sort of series of diminishing returns, where a bird that you've protected from harvest in October, November, in January. We know the goal of all these changes to the grouse season is to increase that baseline population by increasing the number of birds coming into the breeding season. That's our assumption. We're assuming what we're doing is going to help do that, but we're not just resting on assumptions. We will be testing this as we go forward. We'll be looking at, you've heard me talk about the competing models approach, where we'll have one model that says, yes, you're making a difference. The other says, no, you're not. So that we're comparing apples and apples, we'll be looking at northern Pennsylvania and southern New York. And that graph shows you how northern Pennsylvania and southern New York have tracked together since 2014. So we'll be looking for any differences that we can detect in that relationship. Ideally, an improvement in Pennsylvania's status there. In the southern part of the state, we'll look at southern Pennsylvania and compare that with Maryland and West Virginia so that we are using comparable numbers when we're trying to figure out if we're moving the dial on this. Quickly, just to also let you know that we are continuing the West Nile virus research. And the whole idea behind any of this research that we're doing is for management benefit. So we're looking for ways to mitigate the disease as we create more habitat. We're looking at these mosquito pools and figuring out which ones are low risk, like these wetlands, which seem to pose really no risk at all the way up to these very low, shallow, grassy, nutrient-rich areas that I've described to you before, which seem to be very high risk. We'll continue to look at this and try to sort out what's producing the majority of our disease vectors. And we need that information from a public land management, but it's also going to be beneficial to private landowners and camp owners because everybody has a role to play in this. 2018, the summer that just passed, we spent a lot of time trapping mosquitoes across various game lands. We had 11 different game lands involved in every region of the state, looking at things like elevation and distance from forest edge to see if we can find any landscape barriers that we can take advantage of when we're building habitat. If we can find that elevation helps suppress the disease, then we know where we can put grouse habitat, put it where the birds can best take advantage of the opportunity. We did find some very interesting things going on in 2018, but I'm going to keep them secret right now because 2018 was so ridiculous for West Nile virus that I really think we need another year to kind of make sure, do a gut check and make sure that what we're seeing is real. Lots of partners involved. Our primary partner, amazing partners, have been the West Nile virus surveillance program run out of DEP, the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit at Penn State. Several Penn State campuses had kids out there trapping mosquitoes this year, and Bloomsburg University. So these disease studies do require a lot of partners and a lot of collaboration, but we are getting somewhere pretty quickly. You know, it's interesting to do this research in real time while we're also trying to make management decisions. And then just finally, a project that you might not be aware of, Pennsylvania recruited and coordinated all of the eastern states into a large-scale study of West Nile virus in their harvested grouse. So we now have, by combining with the Great Lakes states, we have coverage throughout that entire eastern grouse range. And they're doing what we have been doing for 3 years, which is collecting blood samples from grouse and looking at antibodies. And that's going to help these other states, like it has helped us, figure out where those survivor populations are, where birds have lived through the disease. So that's a very exciting study. So that is my recommendation. Good news and bad news. I think the good news is probably as good as we could have expected it, which is just hold the line on those grouse numbers. And I recommend that we hold the line also on this season and follow that framework that we've established. Thank you.
Commissioner Fredericks. Any change in the age class of the tag?
We haven't. We do have the wings now. We did wing collection this year. We just are getting those in. They're kind of tailing off now, and we have like a 30-day period where I let them dry out before I look at them. But that'll be the next thing we look at is see if...
How about last year? Adult birds?
Last year we were about on par. We're still harvesting more adults than we would like to see, particularly as you get later in the season. We're harvesting, you know, it tips from being majority juvenile to majority adult.
From the beginning of the season to the end of the season?
Really, in December is where you start to see that tip occurred over the past years that we've looked. December, which is not really a big season for grouse, but you start to see the adults become the majority of the harvest. And then in January, again, that's where we were harvesting as much as 60% adults in January. So that was another reason I really took target at that part of the season.
Over the last several years, we're still over 50% adults for the season?
For the season, I would have to look to average it out because we'd have to sort of correct it for effort for when most people are hunting rather than just do a straight out calculation, but I can look at that for you.
Any other questions? Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name's Tom Keller, and I'm serve as the ringneck pheasant, bobwhite quail, and dove biologist for the Commission. And I just want to give you an update kind of on all three of those species, so I'm going to try to breeze through those and then hopefully take any questions you might have for any one of those species or all three. Just to kind of give you a quick briefing of what we're going to look at today, I want to give you an update on our youth hunt within the wild pheasant recovery area here last year. It's our second annual, as well as talk about our final report for this 10-year research project within the WIPRAs. And again, WIPRA is the wild pheasant recovery area, and I'll be referring to it as that. And then under quail, we'll talk about Letterkenny Army Depot, our bobwhite quail focus area, and kind of just give you a progress update on where we're at there, as well as talk about future translocation, trap and transfer wild birds, bringing those birds in, and kind of what that's going to take. And then also end on doves and primarily dove field management as we look into our second year of intense dove field management in Pennsylvania and kind of where we're headed with that. So our wild pheasant youth hunt, again, this is our second annual, second time in over 20 years that we had really true wild pheasant hunting and really get to give that opportunity to youth. And really, this is the reason why we do it. I mean, you see these kids' faces when they show up that morning. Just the excitement is just, it's magical to really see. And so what we do is we bring those kids in over 2 days, 2 mornings of hunts, and provide a safety briefing. And the Northeast region sends down game wardens and helps us with that. Provide a great safety briefing to make sure everybody's solid when we go into the field. Then the next thing we do is we pair each one of those youth up with another youth hunter, and then they're assigned a hunt mentor. And that hunt mentor's job, not only dog handling and providing good dog handling experience and hunting over a dog, but safety in the field, and also just kind of training, teaching those young hunters how to hunt pheasants, and particularly these wild birds. And really, there's a good picture of what that habitat looks like. And if I didn't tell you that was Pennsylvania, it'd be easy to see, why, we have so many birds. That looks just like South Dakota, Kansas, North Dakota, any of the big pheasant states. And I would put our habitat up against any one of those states any day. And you'll see from some of the results that we had as to why that habitat's so important. And the landowners really that are providing that are crucial. So just a couple photos from the hunt this year, and again, once we get the kids out in the field, get them hunting, bring them back in, and get them, a solid lunch, and give them each a gift bag. Everybody walks away from this, with something, even if they don't put a bird in their bag, and it's just really a team effort within PGC and outside of that as well. But this year, we had 40 kids come in, split those over 2 days in November. We hunted 6 farms. We do measure like shot opportunities, so not everyone took a shot. We had about 65 shot opportunities, 45 shots taken, and 1 bird harvested. But we had close to 200 birds put up in 2 mornings of hunting in front of these kids, and half of those were roosters, so close to 100 roosters. And you have to remember, it is a youth hunt, so 45 shots. That's kind of on par when we look at our youth hunts when we're doing stock birds, and you're putting wild birds in front of them, which is a whole nother animal. So, but everyone walked out of the field with smiles on their faces and worn out when you walk kids through this stuff, and it's pretty fun to see. But they just enjoy the devil out of it. So it was a lot of fun. Probably my favorite photo that came out of this. I was privileged to go along with a family of 4. They had 2 daughters, and the mother and the dad came. And so we paired the daughters, obviously, with a mentor. And it was neat to see these young ladies' faces, in expectation and anticipation of the hunt. First ever wild pheasant hunt, and then a father who's telling me how he remembers wild birds and how excited he was to get to introduce his daughters to this. It was humbling, to say the least. So it was certainly need to thank many partners in this. Pheasants Forever, both national, state, and the chapter, Central Susquehanna's chapter. They provide a lot of the food organization and helping us get hunt mentors. and even within PGC, again, the Northeast region providing staff and support for this. Both bureaus, INE and BATS, providing a lot of assistance with this and support, and of course the executive office for continuing to support this program and really providing great opportunity to youth within Pennsylvania. Also need to point out Montour Preserve with the Montour Area Recreation Commission and Washingtonville Fire Department, both of who host each of the hunts for the 2 days that we do it there. And so then that kind of leads us into the final report for this 10-year study that we've been working on. And, this is a project where we, got habitat on the ground through Pheasants Forever, through these landowners, worked very hard in 4 different whippers across the state. And then we brought wild birds in from out west and monitored these birds and conducted a lot of research. And so we want to get that in a paper, get that data analyzed and synthesized to provide that out to the greater pheasant management community, as well as help us make recommendations on where we need to go into the future for wild pheasant management in Pennsylvania. And so again, some of the things we looked at were home range, we looked at survival, and have continued to monitor population density across these 4 whippers. And all that is kind of going in to help us with this decision on what we want to do going forward. The last thing we're kind of waiting on, and unfortunately with the government shutdown, waited another 30 days, but thankfully they're back to work, is the Penn State Cooperative folks are helping us build a statewide pheasant habitat model based on a lot of the work that one of their grad students had done for us. And so once we get that model, that's going to really help us make some solid decisions on some of these recovery areas that we need to make decisions on, frankly, soon, and sooner and later. And so kind of with those 2 that I'm referencing, Higgins-Gratz Valley and Franklin County, these are 2 we haven't met our population objectives there as far as a huntable population. And so again, we need to make decisions on those 2. We're hoping to have this final report. It will be done by April 1st and make recommendations. And we just want to bring this to you today, letting you know that we may have recommendations, not obviously today, but for the next commission meeting on those 2 particular whippers. The Central Susquehanna we feel is solid. We've obviously met our objectives, and we'd like to continue with what we're doing there. But with Higgins-Gratz and Franklin County, these are kind of three of the options that we want to throw out that we may go with, just so you know in advance. One would be to dissolve it like we did with Somerset. We saw populations there pretty well go to 0, as well as habitat, suitable habitat. So that one was fairly clear. The other 2 aren't quite as clear. Another option would be to give it an extension. So we're going to talk with our partners, get this habitat model, and figure out, is it worth an extension, extending that however many years it might be to try to get more habitat on the ground and watch and see if pheasant populations increase in order to have a huntable population. And then the third option, and this one, throughout the project we've kind of started to see, is to kind of refocus some of these areas. So what we've seen over time is that as we have done the research, we see a huge increase in the amount of farmland habitat specialists that are using this. And so, and this is kind of a good example. When you look at this picture, we've got volunteers here, which, certainly need to thank them, doing a flushing survey. And as they're moving through this grass, we had a short-eared owl come out of this grass, and we see them all the time while we're flushing, and that's in the winter time. But in that silo right there is a female barn owl, and she's utilizing this farm because the habitat's there providing food. And she's been there since that cover's been established. Behind the barn, there's an American kestrel box on a pole, produces a brood every year. And then you can also see, it's hard to see up in that top left corner, a deer stand. And every one of these properties, there's stands everywhere because of the immense habitat that this is providing for both game and non-game. And so we kind of see this possibility for a jumping off point, and not completely dissolving, but a jumping off point to provide good habitat for all these other species, and go in more of a focus of a farmland wildlife focus rather than just wild pheasants. But anyhow, I wanted to give you that kind of update. Transition into quail here. Give you an update on Letterkenny Army Depot down in southern Franklin County. This is a 3,600 acre bobwhite quail focus area that we're currently trying to get habitat restored on before we bring in wild quail and bring them back from extirpation. Some of the habitat management we've been doing is a lot of disking, a lot of prescribed fire, and much of that's thanks to the Bureau of Habitat Management, John Wakefield, and South Central Region in Group 4 there, helping us out immensely. We have a timber sale, 1,200-acre timber sale going on as we speak, as well as some limited volunteers and limited personnel resources felling trees just on our own there to try to get some overstory removed. As of now, we've affected about 1,200 acres, and that's been about a year and a half that we've done that, and so we're certainly making progress on very limited resources. This is just some 3 maps. The one on the left and one on the right are very comparable, kind of hard to see, but you can see the one on the left is more of a lighter green, and that's kind of our cover map prior to starting any kind of habitat management. And so a lot of that's kind of like a woodland, a very low quality woodland with some cool season mixed in. And so what we want to get to is the map on the right, which is primarily forbs, annual weeds, with a lot of warm season grass mixed in and protective cover, shrubby cover mixed in. And so that's our goal and objective is on the right there. The middle map is what we've done to date as far as different habitat treatments. And so again, there's a lot mixed in there, and you can see there's a lot of different treatments. The greatest being prescribed fire with about 950 acres of prescribed burning there in about a year and a half. And so that was a pretty big jump from 0 that they'd never had on the facility. These are just some comparison pictures, our photo points. We want to make sure we document everything that we're doing there. And what's most important to look at here is the mountain in the background. That's the North Mountain. And so that's prior to any kind of treatment. And now you can see close to half a mile after removing overstory there. And this is just another example. This is an ag lease field with trees around. To see during the winter time, but this is really what we're getting towards, is removing this overstory and bringing this back to what it really was when this was the last holdout for quail in Pennsylvania, which was primarily a lot of grass and forbs and annual weeds. And so as far as progress goes, you can see towards the bottom there, when we first did our habitat surveys, we estimated through the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative's model that they had come up with, we had about 8 acres of suitable habitat in this 3,600 acre area. So that isn't a whole lot to start with. But it does give you an idea of why we lost quail in Pennsylvania. If this was one of the last places we had birds, and we only had 8 acres left of suitable habitat, it's no question as to why they're gone. But what we did is over a year and a half, and the habitat that we have created, we plugged that back into that same model. Again, this is purely an estimate, so it could be higher or lower, but we approximately have about 714 acres of suitable habitat. So we're just shy of the 50% mark. The most important number, though, is that 1,500 acre mark. And so that's our ultimate minimum goal in order to get birds and bring birds in. And so that's really what we're shooting for. And as far as the translocation goes, so we've been starting to work on this even 2 years in advance before we did any kind of habitat work, talking to all of the other states that are part of NBCI and letting them know that, you know, at some point we'll be needing birds. And this is what we're doing. We've kept them in the loop. We've had them be a part of the planning process, both the habitat management plan as well as this, we developed a translocation plan for bobwhite quail into Pennsylvania. And so by keeping all these other states as a part of that, you're also getting buy-in and creating partnerships. And so right before Christmas, we actually made official requests to 9 states to find out if they're going to be interested in helping us down the road here once we get the habitat in place. And so I've talked to several of those states since, just as of last week. They have some questions, and so I'm hoping to, you know, help them along and answer those questions and hoping to make a decision whether they'd like to partner with us. But again, that most important thing to remember is make sure we reach that 1,500 acres of habitat. And I'd be very remiss if I didn't include and thank all of our partners. We've had a lot of partners come on board with this project to help out in small and great ways alike, and so want to make sure that we give them all the credit that is due, and we're very thankful for each one of them. The last thing I'll mention here, and this is hoping not to bring up like a three-letter disease within my presentation, but this is a West Nile virus challenge study that wild turkeys and bobwhite quail are a part of, really following suit in Lisa's cutting-edge research, and Mary Jo has taken this upon herself to really move this forward. And so we included bobwhites in that, but primarily here in Pennsylvania, that'll be wild turkeys. And she's working very closely with Mitch Blake, with NWTF, the regional biologist. He's really the one that secured a lot of the funding for this. So we're very thankful for his hard work. Also working with University of Georgia and NBCI. And so Mary Jo will be working with a lot of partners in the state and cooperators to collect eggs this year. And it'll be very similar to what Lisa had done with grouse. Really find out, is West Nile virus affecting the turkeys of Pennsylvania as well as bobwhite quail across the range. And real quickly, to finish up with mourning doves, last year, 2018, was the first year we really made an effort at managed dove fields in Pennsylvania, and I think it went well, especially with some of the time crunches we had. With the weather, you know, spring just ended here about a month ago, so, you know, we've been up against rain all year long. And so it worked out well. I actually talked to Lauren Furbearer from Middle Creek to kind of find out, follow up with her on how things went down there. She was very pleased with how it went. She had a lot of good feedback, and hunters killed over 150 birds down there over a 13-day period, and really were happy with it and wanted more. And so that's a good sign. That was really the only place that we could really have a lot of feedback from. But I think moving forward, we know that hunters in Pennsylvania are interested in dove fields. So what we did is, working with Bureau of Habitat Management and Director Sussenbach directing this, kind of move forward. We talked to over 20 different states that had dove field programs, and got all their feedback and kind of synthesized that into best management practices for Pennsylvania, what we could do for PA. And so moving forward, we're just about to finish those up, get those out to our habitat management staff for 2019, and I think we'll have some really quality managed dove fields coming into the September season here in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, we'll continue our statewide banding effort and assist any kind of regional research efforts. We'll do our best to assist with. So with that, I'll end, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to tackle them for you.
Any questions, comments from the commissioners? No? Very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
It's almost the last of the day. Yep. So that concludes our session for today. Commissioners will need to meet upstairs in the conference room. We'll be back tomorrow again at 8:30 a.m.